Good afternoon. My name is Miguel Ampuero, and I am a consultant with the Pod Autism Initiative ABA Supports.
Hi, I'm Jolyn Jackson. I'm also a consultant for the Autism Initiative for ABA Supports. And today we're going to talk to you guys about the role of the behavior analyst as a supervisor. We're here from the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistant Network, and we're also always looking to work on our mission as a role of the special educators under the Bureau of Special Education and providing students with the services that they need to best meet their needs. Our goal for each child is to ensure the IEP teams have a role in working towards the least restrictive environment.
So in this presentation, our intention is to provide you guys with sort of like specific details regarding the role of the behavior analyst as supervisor. And of course, adding to that, providing details of the supervision process. So we're gonna start with an overview of supervision, look at specific details suggested in the literature and of course in practice, such as the role of training of aspiring behavior analysts and behavior analysts at the assistant level and of course registered behavior technicians. Additional details such as the evaluation and ongoing professional development. And we're gonna end this presentation with a few comments on the ethics, or the role of ethics in the supervision process, as well as some barriers for effective supervision. So what is the purpose of supervision? The purpose of supervision is to improve and maintain the behavior analytic, professional, and ethical repertoires of the supervisee and facilitate the delivery, of course, of high quality behavior analytic services. But we have a problem, and perhaps it is not so much of a problem. Currently, higher education institutions have developed behavior analytic training programs to fulfill the demand at a rapid pace. The number of programs that have really emerged in the over the last decade has really been great. There's over 300 training programs worldwide, which lead to board certification and applied behavior analysis. So this growing need of students pursuing undergraduate and graduate education in applied behavior analysis creates really a corresponding increase in supervision for those students, as of course stated in our compliance and ethics code. So as the ongoing growth of professionals already in the field providing behavior analytics services, not only as at the master's level or professional level as behavior analysts, but also as registered behavior technicians and board certified assistant behavior analysts. So in order to be able to provide supervision to aspiring behavior analysts or those already in roles of behavior analysts, the Behavior Analysis Certification Board has established guidelines for practitioners to be able to provide supervision to those soon to become behavior analysts. So this curriculum describes the purpose and important features of supervision, emphasizing the training and measuring acquisition of improvement and maintenance of skills through the use of training strategies such as behavioral skills training and the use of effective performance feedback, as well as the implementation of performance monitoring systems. It is one of the goals of this training program to engage in professional development activities to improve supervisory performance. And that is one of the goals of this presentation, to provide you with professional development and education as to how to become a better supervisor. Effective January 1st, 2015, the BACB only permits supervision for BCBAs in good standing that have completed an 8-hour supervision workshop and have maintained 3 credit hours of continuing education credits in the area of supervision. So we have a situation now, which is I have completed my coursework in behavior analysis. I have obtained my master's degree, so I have graduated from a graduate program, and I passed my BCBA's exam. So technically speaking, you could supervise. So what are the required qualifications of for a new supervisor? A BCBA or BCBAD in good standing. Supervisor who hold BCBA or BCBAD certification must also meet an ongoing number of continuing education credits requirement. Also, a licensed or registered psychologist certified by the American Board of Professional Psychology in behavioral or cognitive psychology who was tested in applied behavior analysis, or an authorized verified course sequence instructor who provides supervision in a practicum or intensive practicum level. So per the guidelines, a new behavior analyst who has completed the training and who has maintained some continuing education credits in supervision and behavior analysis should be able to provide supervision to aspiring behavior analysts. But what these guidelines do not suggest are the qualitative aspects of being a good supervisor, or what are some of the skills that you need to become to be able to provide supervision in an effective manner. And of course, complying guidelines of our ethical or of our code of ethics. So are we ready to supervise? Before getting into whether we're ready to supervise or not, first of all, we need to make clear what effective and competent supervision is important, what it is and why is it important. So basically accepting supervision is a pretty straightforward process. If somebody solicits supervision from a professional behavior analyst and you have completed the requirements as stated before, you without a problem should be able to provide supervision. Effective supervision actually helps prepare professionals in our field, effective, competent practitioners actually. So what our goal in supervision, of course, is to not only provide them with the necessary skills to be able to deliver high quality behavior analytics services, but also making sure that the quality of those skills are performed with a level of competence. And of course, you know, aside from behavior analytics skills, also being an ethical professional who is always working in the best interest of the clients or the population they serve. Now, another component that it's important about supervision from the standpoint of the supervisor is that it allows to increase your knowledge regarding various aspects of the behavior analysis certification board task list. You know, as a supervisor, just learning about or becoming more familiar with or more competent with a variety of areas of the task list makes you a more or a well-rounded practitioner. It also allows you to practice and improve your interpersonal skills, build and grow personal and professional network. So to start transitioning back to whether you're ready to supervise once you have finished your coursework and you have passed your BCBA exam, let's start with a case scenario here. So the phone call went really well. The potential trainee seemed like a bright person with a promising future. He not only wanted the accrued supervision hours, but was interested in conducting applied research with a population that was near and dear to my heart. The director of his program was a professional acquaintance of mine who would support the supervision process wholeheartedly. I felt like I could help him become an effective clinician, and the work we would do together also have a positive collateral effects in the program that he worked in. After some agonizing consideration, I turned down the opportunity to supervise. So the question in this case would be, if everything went well, why did this professional behavior analyst actually decided not to supervise? So what are some reasons not to supervise in this case? Well, going back to the scenario, of course, after agonizing consideration, perhaps the behavior analyst considered that he's under a, he's working under an increased workload, which may involve taking on several other projects in addition to having to supervise someone, an aspiring behavior analyst, to become an ethical and competent behavior analyst, which also has a relation with time. Do I have the time necessary to provide effective and competent supervision? Do I know the task list the way that I should in order to provide supervision services to my supervisees in the way that they're going to benefit from the process? If I'm not really well, or not really familiarized, or I'm not really competent with various aspects of the task list, I may not actually be doing due diligence by providing effective supervision. Or maybe I am very competent with various aspects of the task list. I have time. Maybe my responsibilities allow me to provide supervision, but I have little to no experience with the actual process of supervision, So those aspects are critical in making the decision whether this specific point in time is the right point or the right time to actually begin providing supervision. So tying it back to the BACB Code of Ethics, when considering a request to supervise, we have to keep in mind the following. All behavior analysts provide services, teach, and conduct research only within boundaries of their competence, defined as being commensurate with their education, training, and supervised experience. So what this is suggesting is that we're going to provide supervision only on areas that we are competent to provide supervision on. And of course, if we are not competent, we're going to have to seek additional sources of training. So if I am a new BCBA, I can't supervise? Is that what you guys are saying? No, that's not what we're saying. Going back to guidelines established by the BACB, once you have passed the BACB exam or the BCBA exam, and you have completed the requirements for supervision, you should be able to supervise. But if you want to provide supervision services, and you feel like you're lacking specific aspects mentioned before, such as not having in-depth knowledge of the task list, or being really new or not having been exposed to being a supervisor, you're gonna have to take some steps to remedy some of those conditions. With that said, we also have to say that even for new supervisors, it is an opportunity for growth. So we will have our first experience supervising. We just have to make sure when the right time for that is. So to keep you guys active a little bit in the topic of supervision, we're gonna incorporate some active student responding. So all of the following are reasons not to supervise, except number 1, knowledge of the task. Number 2, increased workload. Number 3, experience with supervision. Number 4, I just completed my supervision training, so that means that I must be ready to supervise. So please take a second to come up with the answer. And for those of you who have number 4, that is the right answer. All of these are reasons not to supervise. Or potential problems that may arise that may actually lead us to consider not supervising. Knowledge, not enough knowledge of specific tasks, increased workload, and experience with supervision, or lack of experience with supervision. Of course, number 4 would be the answer. But Miguel, what is supervision? So what is this process that we are supervisors, of course, have a responsibility to, assist in the development of new professional behavior analysts? Well, supervising or supervision is also behavior. It's behaving. It's taking action, to improve inadequate performance or learning of supervisees and to support them and maintain quality performance and or learning. It is taking action, but also being committed. You know, the process that involves a manager or supervisor or other professional in a supervisory role meeting regularly, not just when you can, regularly, and interacting with workers to review their work, in this case, supervisees. Supervision also provides, aims to provide accountability for both the supervisor and supervisee in exploring practice, what to do in a specific case of situation. It is actually a two-way learning process. I may learn from my supervisees, which, often happens, as I will be providing information for my supervisees that would actually enrich their knowledge and perhaps allow them to become better practitioners. What is evidence-based supervision? It's, some of the components in that have been considered as part of evidence-based supervision include identifying desired supervision outcomes, number one. So I need to know what is it that I want to get out of when supervising. And specify and identify what supervisors must do to assist supervisee in attaining the desired outcome. So what are going to be some of my roles? What are my tasks? What are going to be my goals or the goals that I need to achieve in helping my supervisee? Train and educate supervisees in the performance of skills related to practice. Of course, providing evidence-based training programs or establishing an evidence-based training program so that my supervisees actually acquire the skills that are necessary for them to be competent in their practices. Monitor their performance. As I train, I also need to make sure that the skills that they have recently acquired are also maintained, and they are maintained at optimal levels of implementation. So in order to do that, I need to make sure that I develop systems of data that are going to allow me to make best decisions possible. Support proficient supervisee performance. Reinforce the behaviors that we want to see increase, of course, and behaviors that are going well. Correct non-proficient performance. Provide corrective feedback and attempt to provide additional opportunities for practice of those skills that my supervisee may actually be struggling with. Evaluation of supervisee's performance outside of the realm of supervision and outcomes related to the supervisee program. Try to evaluate also their performance, not only when supervision, but also outside of the supervision process. Stay in touch with your supervisor, with your supervisee, and make sure that things are going well in their job placements. Another thing to consider when determining whether it is the right time for supervision are the logistics of supervision. So before entering into a supervision or supervisory relationship, there are a few details to consider. Is this going to be a side job? There are some professional supervisors that actually do it for compensation. If I relate it to my already responsibilities or the responsibilities I already have, how am I going to balance this out? So is this going to be an additional responsibility, a side job, something that I'm going to do in the context of my current responsibilities of my job? Am I protected? We are in a human service field, so things can go wrong. Malpractice can occur. So we have to make sure that we seek ways to protect ourselves from any specific issue that we may encounter in practice. Communication. How am I going to communicate sensitive data? How am I going to manage confidentiality of specific cases? Or like the security of communications nowadays with supervision taking different formats. Or for instance, in times like ours, like now, where we are in the middle of a pandemic and people are not able to get together or supervisors and supervisees are not able to get together to have face-to-face meetings or in-person meetings. Am I going to create materials for supervision? So do I have the time and resources necessary so that these can be prepared in advance? So I'm not just simply improvising when providing supervision, that my supervision process are well designed in a sequential manner. Some additional important considerations is to take the issue seriously, as I said. It's not just a meeting a week for an hour or an hour and a half to talk about how the week went or how the work week went. You know, it is actually a process where you're actively going to try to shape up skills of a professional behavior analyst, or the skills necessary to be a competent professional behavior analyst. Seek assistance from experts in areas where you may not feel too comfortable. This doesn't have to be, or doesn't have to do anything with pride. We actually need to be humble as professional behavior analysts. If there is an area that we don't feel too competent on, but we are still providing supervision, then we must seek out knowledge and experience and expertise from others that are more better versed in a specific area that we may not feel too comfortable. And of course, an important and exciting it is to help in the shaping of future behavior analysts. It is more important to get off the right foot, which means that, of course, you know, now we are very excited because we have become a professional behavior analyst. I have my certification. I can help in a different way, perhaps. But maybe at the beginning, what I need to focus on is start well as a professional behavior analyst before I try to provide help to others in a formal manner, in a formal process. Another ASR, 2 steps in evidence-based supervision include, number 1, identified supervision outcomes. Number 2, monitor the supervisee performance. Number 3, options 1 and 2. And number 4, only meeting with the supervisee to see how his or her week is going. Please take a second to come up with the answer. And of course, the answers are number 1 and 2. Identify the supervision outcomes and monitor supervisee performance. Another ASR. Considerations regarding the logistics of supervision include, number 1, supervision as a side job. Number 2, materials and media creation. Number 3, communication. Number 4, protection. And number 5, all of these are correct options. And of course, the answer is number 5. All of these are correct options. In addition, I am a new supervisor, or I am considering supporting an aspiring behavior analyst or somebody completing coursework and getting ready to take their exam, or already, you know, a BCBA or a BCABA, I'm sorry, or RBT. So I need to also consider some additional factors, such as what type of supervision will I be providing? Am I going to be providing face-to-face supervision? Is this supervision going to be remote? Is this type, you know, the format of supervision going to be in group? So all of these components, though, have the main goal of shaping specific, professional behavior analytic skills. Among them, there are nuances that would actually make them slightly different. First of all, let's go over or remind you guys of the BACB experience standards. You know, so as we know, there is a current requirement of 1,500 hours, which soon will switch to 2,000 hours. And there are options such as practicum and intensive practicum, which are only available for graduate programs. You know, the minimum number of supervisors, supervisee contacts in independent field work is 2 contacts, and for practicum and independent practicum, there is an increased level of supervision. Practicum 4 contacts, and intensive practicum 8 contacts. Supervision hours per supervisory period, which is a month. So in supervised independent field work, I need to have 5% of my total hours be supervised. Practicum, 7.5% of my total hours be supervised, and in intensive practicum, which is the most intense form of supervision, at least 10% of the hours, the total hours must be supervised. In the case of face-to-face supervision, which is, you would consider the most ideal format. There is a one-to-one interaction between the supervisor and the supervisee, which allows for the live observation of the supervisee's performance in the environment of practice as they are working directly with specific clients. It is also, it is a type of supervision that actually allows you to provide immediate direct feedback on performance, as well as distinguish what are some of the specific variables that affect the behavior of the supervisee and the practice settings, and try to remedy those. Of course, the overall provision of better opportunities to shape clinical skills. So this type of supervision would be the most ideal because it provides you with the better or best case scenario for shaping the skills of a professional behavior analyst, or the skills necessary to be competent in their practices. Nowadays, remote supervision becomes an option as well. Of course, ideally, all supervision, we would like it to be in situ. However, the rapid expansion of our field provides a view, given the rapid expansion of our field, this option actually provides a viable option. Increasing number of online programs, which force, and the unavailability perhaps of supervisors in specific areas. Increases the number of, as I already mentioned, increasing number of offline programs, and as I mentioned, the unavailability of qualified supervisors locally, which actually would put the supervisee in a situation to try to find a supervisor, or try to establish a relation in which the supervisor-supervisee relationship is actually remote. However, before actually attempting to undertake this specific responsibility or supervising from a distant manner, you have to understand what the challenges of this format would be. You have to understand that there may be challenges regarding technology. What are going to be some of the ethical considerations related to providing remote supervision, as well as how are you going to be competent as a supervisor in shaping the clinical skills necessary for your supervisee to acquire the skills. First of all, acquire the skills, shape the skills necessary, and maintain the skills necessary for them to be competent in their practices. So what are some tips for holding effective supervision, individual supervision meetings? And this could include actually in-person or remote formats. Number one, confirm the meeting time and location. Of course, being supervision, at least having a reference of the time and the avenue or the media to be used. Send the agenda for the meeting ahead of time. Send documents relevant to the supervision meeting. If there is going to be a specific topic, make sure that you're providing those documents ahead of time so that your supervisee has an opportunity to review them. Conduct the meeting in a timely manner. Start at the time that you're supposed to start and end at the time that you're supposed to end. Begin supervision meeting with a quick summary of the agenda. Let them know what the meeting is going to be about in case there are any misconceptions of what the meeting will be like. Note, for your purposes, the amount of time each item on the agenda took. Perhaps this could be an indicator whether that specific item on the agenda deserves a little more time, or it's something that you could decide, of course, with your supervisee to spend a little more time on, or to focus on future supervision meetings. End the meeting with a to-do list. Provide some assignments for your supervisees that are going to prepare them for the next meeting, or prepare them for the skills that you're going to be covering or working with during your next meetings. And of course, have supervision forms ready and available for signatures if necessary. Yet another format of supervision can be group format, and this is, of course, in addition to individual supervision, as most of us in the position of as being supervisors, only up to 50% of the hours of experience can actually come from, or 50% of the supervised hours can actually come from group supervision. And this idea of group supervision is actually a really good one. It may actually further the supervisees, or it may provide the opportunity to further the supervisees' understanding of themselves as practitioners, as clients with whom they work with, or understanding, themselves as practitioners, understanding their clients that they work with, and of course, um, understanding themselves as as members of a service delivery system, and of course, know about what the system of service delivery is. Usually, supervisors determine groups, purpose, goals, and formats of discussion. So it is up to you to consider what are going to be, or to determine what are going to be some of the relevant topics to cover during your group supervision meetings. It is time efficient and cost effective format. What the BACB suggests is that groups in group supervision should have no more than 10 participants, and of course, all participants sharing common interest. What are going to be some of the benefits of group supervision? Well, it provides you with unique opportunities to establish critical professional repertoires, you know? Like for instance, an opportunity for peer feedback, public speaking, being able to speak about behavior analysis in front of others, disseminate behavior analysis to others in ways that may not be so amenable for others outside of behavior analysis, create a social network, having multiple listeners for an event, not only having others listen to what you have to say, but also listen to what others have to say in respect to a specific topic. Modeling and rehearsing positive and productive discussion. A lot of what we do as behavior analysts is discuss current aspects and issues in our field. Observational learning and developing of empathy, as well as provide social comparisons from me to other peers in supervisions. This actually would allow you to determine where you stand with regards to your ethics, competencies, and professional skills in relation to your peers. The quality of group supervision by the supervisor's arrangement of components of this experience in order to maximize the effectiveness of these learning opportunities. So it is up to us to really, we are responsible for ensuring the quality of the supervision experience when supervision is actually provided in a group format. So what are some tips for encouraging safe and productive group meetings? Number one, arrive early and be punctual. Number two, plan activities with time. Share with your supervisees for preparation. So prepare, again, do not improvise. Be open to supervisees' viewpoints, very important. Again, as I mentioned, this is a learning process that is two ways. As you provide information that actually enriches your supervisees' repertoires, they also provide with information that actually enriches yours. Foster ownership of opinion. Relate discussions to concepts and principles. Provide opportunities to all participants. Foster active participation. Assign timekeepers so everyone has an equal opportunity to participate, which is very important. State opinion of agreement and disagreement. It is okay to disagree in our field, as long as those disagreements, or those statements are actually provided in a respectful manner. And foster conversations, discussions among your group members. So not only you being a lecturer, but also having your supervisees being able to discuss specific topics. Another ASR. Types of supervision include, number one, face-to-face. Number two, remote. Number three, social meeting at a bar to talk about behavior analysis. Number four, group supervision. Or number five, options 1, 3, and 4 are correct. And the answer is number 1, 3, and 4 are the options correct. Even though sometimes it's really rewarding to have a drink with a peer or with a group of colleagues and discuss aspects and issues in behavior analysis, but perhaps the setting is not the most appropriate to hold supervision. So face-to-face meetings, remote supervision, and group supervision will be types of supervision formats. Tips for successful face-to-face meetings include send an agenda for the meeting, call when running late, postpone because you have a game to play, and meeting with a to-do list. So the answers will be Number 5, send an agenda for the meeting and end the meeting with a to-do list. ASR number 3 in this area. Tips for successful group supervision meetings would include: number 1, being open to supervisees' viewpoints. Number 2, provide opportunities for only one participant. Number 3, do not allow for disagreement. Number 4, relate discussions to concepts and principles. And number 5, only 1 and 4 are correct. And of course, the answer in this case would be number 5. Be open to supervisees' viewpoints and relate discussions to the concepts and principles.
Hi guys, so now I'm going to keep talking to you guys a little bit more about the process of supervision. For the process of supervision, we need to look at both the beginning, the middle, and then the end. These 3 areas are going to help guide the role of supervision for the supervisor and the supervisee. Knowing the general flow of the supervision allows the supervisors to keep the documentation organized, plan and identify assessment needs, and prepare or plan supervisee trainings. By having this system in place, it will keep the supervision process organized for the supervisee. It's important in the process of supervision to establish that supervisory relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee, do a skills assessment to see what skills need to be focused on throughout the supervision process, understand the job model of what the supervisee is going to be working to best mimic what the supervision needs to focus on, most importantly. Not to say that other areas won't be a priority, but we want to make sure that the job model is guiding the supervision in order to make the supervisee prepared for their job placement following the supervision opportunities. Looking at goal setting and creating competencies is also very critical, which I'm going to talk in more detail about soon. But it's important to have those goals so that we have the targeted behaviors that help us guide where the supervisee needs additional training and have they met those competencies with the mastery criteria. What ongoing training needs are going to be part of the process, how we're going to monitor their performance ongoing, and then the last part of it is how do we end that supervisor relationship. And throughout that process, we can look at the evaluation of the supervisee's overall skill development, the effectiveness of the supervisor, and the professional development planning for the future. Individuals may receive supervision in different types of settings. You have the university practicum, the job, or a BCBA who offers contracted supervision services. It's important to remember that no experience can be accrued before the supervisor and supervisee sign a contract. This is critical because we don't want to begin the process without having that conversation and that contract that outlines the responsibilities for each party. Establishing the supervisory relationship with the contract provides a clear description of the responsibilities of the supervisor and the supervisee, the scope of the activities considered appropriate for the experienced hours, which I'm going to show in a little bit what is considered appropriate and what is considered not appropriate for those hours, because there are sometimes ones that may appear to be appropriate, but we need to always refer back to our BACB task list to determine what is appropriate and what is not. Instructional objectives for the supervisee. It's critical to clearly define in objective and measurable terms the criteria that must be met for our supervisees so that they understand where they started and where they finished in the mastery criteria and objectives throughout. The criteria also must be completed on the experience verification form so that we have ongoing documentation of these different products. The consequences for failing to adhere to the contract. So if the contract isn't followed, having the conversation of what happens after that, and then making sure you have consent when applicable. You want to make sure you review the contract in detail. This is not only to protect the supervisee, but also to protect the supervisor. Having this contract is really going to guide the process. It allows for the questions needed for both parties. It describes the purpose of the supervision using the BACB supervisor training outline, and it has the supervisee list out all the activities to credit towards the fieldwork requirements, both in frequency and in duration. In general, we want to focus on the development of new behavior analytics skills following the BACB's 5th edition task list. These also are going to align with the 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis, which many of you are probably very familiar with, looking at those dimensions related to applied behavioral, analytic, conceptually systematic, technological, effective, and generality. These are all components that will be part of the supervision process. And it gives supervisees, we want to make sure we're giving them varied experiences. Having them have opportunities in multiple sites will provide them with opportunities across different types of clients, students, and settings. Having different supervisors is also helpful because a lot of different supervisors have different professional backgrounds, different histories in their workplace. And so that can really add into the supervision experience by allowing that supervisee to have the opportunities for those different professional roles. And then often having opportunities with different types of cases. So working with students versus working with adults in different types of settings, whether it be clinic or school-based or some other type of setting. So just making sure that those supervisees have those experiences if possible. And if those experiences are not possible, at least having the conversation of what else is available. So here is from the BACB Experience Standards, the list of the acceptable activities that you guys can have access to on the website as well as throughout this presentation. But you can look through that list and just see that a lot of it is related to making sure we have activities relating to conducting the assessments, designing and implementing, writing the behavioral treatments, overseeing the implementation of the programs, training others, communicating and collaborating with the other professionals, all fall under those roles as the acceptable activities. For the unacceptable activities, most of these will be pretty obvious, but there are a few that stand out that I think are important to kind of point out that maybe if you are attending a professional content conference or workshop related to behavior analysis, can those count as your hours? No, right? So those are great opportunities for professional development, but wouldn't be considered an acceptable hour counted towards, acceptable activity counted towards your hours. So you want to establish in that initial meeting the clear expectations, making sure that it is critical, that it's evidence-based supervision. You have an open discussion of those types of expectations. What type of activities should be worked on outside of supervision? Will there be some type of homework, you know, reading different articles, logging on to watch different conference sessions, listening to podcasts? What type of activities would be would be recommended by your supervisor to do outside of the supervision time? Expectations during your supervision meeting. Are you bringing some type of permanent product? Do you have a to-do list that you needed to accomplish prior to coming, and then you would review that at your meeting, and then tracking any documentation? Supervisees cannot be expected to meet the performance expectations if those expectations are not clearly defined. So we need to make sure, in order to set up for success for both the supervisor and the supervisee, that we have these discussions that outline these expectations. Receiving and accepting feedback. This is critical. Sometimes not always our favorite thing to do, because it could be a little bit awkward if someone's not ready to hear that type of feedback, but setting that tone ahead of time will really help so that your supervisee knows that feedback is part of this process. It's the only way we're going to get better in our field. As supervisors, we're giving each other feedback all of the time, and so we want to make sure that supervisees are comfortable with this process too. The supervisor can explain to the supervisee that this is really just to allow them to gain areas of strength and recognize the area of weakness, which will then help focus on areas for training. You'll set expectations regarding how that feedback should be given as well as how it should be accepted. You know, is that feedback best if you do it face-to-face during your meetings? Is this something that you would potentially have an ongoing conversation with when you're on site in the direct modeling opportunities? So having those conversations of when the feedback will be given, how the feedback will be accepted, and then what you will do with that feedback in terms of future training opportunities. You want to make sure that you're creating and committing to a positive relationship, because this is an ongoing relationship. Like I mentioned, there's the beginning, the middle, and the end. But then later in the presentation, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit more about how even after the relationship is over, in terms of your supervisor-supervisee relationship, you still want to maintain that relationship post the experience, because there's a lot of professional development and mentorship that can continue. So we want to make sure that from the very beginning, we're creating a really positive relationship that is pleasant and caring, empathetic, optimistic, as well as professional. It's a new science, it's evolving, there's lots for us to be learning. So we want to make sure that this is part of the process and that we're serving as the model for this as the supervisor, for the supervisee to also have that opportunity to observe it and then use it in their own professional opportunities. The overarching goal of the supervisor should be to develop and foster a relationship where feedback and guidance is valued, and the supervisee wants to attend and be an active participant in the supervision meeting and the overall learning process. This is so interesting from the Sellers article, because these are kind of the same things we say to teachers when we're in a classroom, making sure that kids want to be there. They want to be working with you. They're approaching you for the information that they need, that it's an active classroom with active instruction. It's no different than what we need for supervision. We want our supervisees to have that same approach behavior towards us, looking for the information, seeking out the information for the learning process so that they can then gain the skills to be the best that they can be in the field of behavior analysis. Here's an ASR. Components of the supervision process include: 1, establish supervisory relationship; 2, goal setting; 3, skills assessment; 4, ongoing performance monitoring training; 5, all of the above. So if your answer was 5, you are correct. These were the different areas that I've reviewed with you guys already, talking about the importance of establishing that relationship, setting those goals, assessing where the needs are for the training purposes, and then how are we going to monitor those training needs. Here's another ASR. In order to establish the supervisory relationship, 1, we need a contract to be established; 2, no contract needed; 3, hours can be accrued before the contract is reviewed and signed; 4, supervisee can be supervised by another, more experienced supervisee. If your answer was number 1, you are correct. A contract needs to be established. All of the other responses are incorrect. We know there needs to be a contract. We know that hours cannot be accrued before the contract is signed, and a supervisee can only be supervised by a supervisor. How do we do the skills assessment? How do we determine which performances we need to look at? We can be referencing most often the task list, finding the baseline of the measure for the supervisee's skills, and then the process in which we do the assessment could be varied through an interview, portfolio review, discussion, self-assessment, oral and written quizzes for competency checks, observation, and review of products. We want the assessment to help us evaluate our supervisory effectiveness. This assessment helps not only understand where the supervisee is, but also for us to determine ongoing how we're doing as a supervisor. Because if they're gaining the skills, then we know as a supervisor, we're providing them the type of supervision that they need. This should occur prior to beginning the training process so that we have a baseline and to determine where we need to go, and then we can do a post-evaluation assessment to determine if the skills were all met, but this should be going on throughout as well. It allows for the identification of which skills would be the focus on for the training efforts and can decrease the time supervisees spend on training. Once we understand where those skills are, then we can then prioritize where our training needs to be, rather than taking it all on and knowing that the supervisee already had experience in that area. We can do the skills assessment through our direct methods, basically just having a conversation and observing the participant, evaluating the assessment, and making sure that we are looking across different direct observation measures. Having the supervisee rate the skill level for each job is also really helpful, because this really helps us to target the training efforts appropriately. And it's also a way to kind of do a self-assessment to determine what they want to work on, and also would help us to align where they are with their self-assessment. Does it match their performance level and their training needs, or does there need to be some type of feedback given in that area? And we can use methods related to quizzes, interviews, and direct methods for that self-report. You want to make sure when you're doing your assessment that you have defined, provided the definitions needed for that competency, explain the content, give examples and non-examples, and critically evaluate the scenarios. Performance-based competencies typically are completed in vivo observations and role-playing activities as well. Here's an ASR. Skills assessment will 1, occur before beginning in the training process. 2, increase time supervisee spends in training. 3, not provide focus for training effort. 4, evaluate supervisor effectiveness. And your skills assessment will occur before beginning the training process. The job model. Here we want to look at basically what performance responsibilities are associated with the job. These can take different forms and be called different names. There's called job model, it can be called a responsibility matrix, but the really looking at the high and low priority skills to focus on during training is the role of this. It's best to match your training setting to the environment in which the performance will occur naturally. In your job models, you want to look at the different ways that things can be organized based off the specific utility to the supervisee's organization. And in supervision for the aspiring BCBAs, you want to examine which task list items are most relevant to the performance of the supervisee in an organization, prioritize your skills, and align the job responsibilities to the task list items. For your goal setting and creating your competencies, you want to have competency-based or goal-oriented supervision, really establishing a predetermined mastery criteria for each behavior or goal selected. So once you determine those behavior and those training needs for your supervisee, you want to determine what is that mastery criteria. What do they need to meet in order for you to kind of quote unquote check off that this goal has been mastered and that they're ready to move into their next training topic. And so having the conversation with your supervisee of what is the mastery criteria, what is the targeted behavior, and what is the goal selected will be a way to determine if you've met those competencies. Goal setting and creating competencies, you want to make sure that that you have a method for teaching these and promoting the skills within the supervisor relationship. What are you going to do in order to teach these skills to your supervisee? Will you be modeling these, having them review additional articles on different topics, having them observe different sessions and settings, a combination of these methods, or something else that would meet the needs of that supervisee? And you want to make sure you first determine where their baseline is and where you're going, and will help in the result of having a meaningful performance in their improvement. You want to make sure that your goal setting is based on the individual's abilities. So just looking specifically, using that previous skills assessment that you took and seeing where their individual abilities are, and then determining from there where you need to go with short-term and long-term goals. Consider using the task list items related to the job model, the supervisor's overall progress on mastering those task list items, and anticipate any needs of the organization or critical outcomes for the client. So anything that could kind of come of this, what are the next steps when those goals are met? If the supervisee has no experience with a specific targeted skill, then you need to be planful in the way you're going to teach this. Consider setting the goal for a reasonable time period that would allow them to achieve the goal. So you may need to break it down into weekly, monthly, quarterly, semester type goals if they have no experience with the targeted skill. And then you would involve the supervisee in activities that allow them for opportunities to build that specific skill in the setting that is most natural related to their job model. Once long-term goals are established, you can then move into your next area that you've prioritized for that job model. It can be established with longer term outcomes in mind or set moving into the next targeted skill. It can be reviewed each supervisory period, and the supervisor should consider immediate needs of the organization for critical outcomes for the client. So really looking at that relevance related to that job. Here's an ASR. Goal setting and creating competency include 1, goal setting based on individual abilities. 2, skills assessment to set up training goals. 3, goal reviewed every 6 months. 4, 1 and 2. 5, no mastery criteria needed to be determined for selecting goals. Your response should be 1 and 2, goal setting based on individual abilities, as well as skills assessment for setting up training goals. Okay, guys, so now that I've talked to you about the skills assessment, setting up the contract, what is considered how you accrue your hours, what are appropriate acceptable activities, and what are unacceptable activities, that ongoing assessment process, now we're going to talk to you guys about performance management and training, and I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Miguel.
Thank you, Jolene. So as Jolene mentioned, I am going to continue with this presentation and start the topic of performance management and training, which is really a big component in the supervision process. So first of all, just to provide a little bit of an overview on training, to be consistently successful, a training program should have a performance basis and a competency basis. And we're gonna start looking at what do these two things actually mean? To be performance, basis, or to have a performance basis and to be a competency based program. First of all, what is the basic goal of training? It is providing individuals with basic knowledge and skills, and I'm going to stress the word skills again, to perform and implement their functions of their specific roles or responsibilities in a quality manner. In our specific case, there has to be a very specific focus, which is the development of skills, specifically behavior analytics skills that are going to allow our supervisees to perform their duties, deliver their interventions, deliver behavior analytics services in a quality manner. Of course, the development and acquisition of concepts is very important. But before we actually dive into training in itself, let's define some concepts that really come across fairly frequently in the literature and actually in practice as well, such as performance management. What is performance management? What is competency-based training? What is performance-based training? There may be some confusion as to perhaps some overlapping, between these two terms. So our goal here is to try to provide a clear definition for each of them so we have a clear understanding of what these actually mean. So of course, when looking at performance management, just by training itself, of course, considering that training is a critical component of training, however, alone may not be sufficient. We may need some additional systems in place in order to make sure that our training is as effective as it can be, So specifically, performance management is a set of procedures for increasing desired performances. It is research-based and of course derived from the principles of applied behavior analysis, specifically in the area of organizational behavioral management. It is a set of procedures which combines antecedents-based interventions as well as consequence-based interventions when developing this training package. It is a system for maximizing all types of performance. It is most effective, of course, at improving implementation of skills procedures in a variety of settings, which in our case would be educational, clinical, or even businesses in which behavior analytics skills can actually be implemented. What is competency-based training then? So we already know what performance management is as a system which combines procedures for developing effective systems of training. But now, what is competency-based training? It's a system of training, of course. The training is not complete until the supervisee has demonstrated competence in an area addressed by the training. It is usually done in a sequential manner, and we are progressing through competencies. We have goals and objectives. So it is goal-oriented type of training. So now, what is performance-based training? It is performance training. It is based on what we do, which really matters. Showing the individual how to perform job duties or target behaviors, as well as having the individual or our supervisees in this case practice the skills that they have just observed, And these, of course, happen under the process of supervision while being actually supervised. It is a critical component in skill acquisition and professional development, So, of course, as I mentioned before, in our field, it is critical to develop concepts, and have the conceptual basis related to those specific skills or specific procedures. But of course, it is critical to also acquire or develop a concept for the acquisition of specific skills, and being able, us as supervisors, to see implementation of specific skills so we can actually provide feedback, shape specific performances, as well as once they have been acquired, to maintain those through the use of systems of data monitoring. So as I mentioned, performance-based training is critical in the acquisition of skills and professional development. Now, of course, a lot of training programs are often defective, or this specific component is often defective in specific training programs, because training programs may focus, as I mentioned, on information sharing rather than actually skill building. So the focus here would be on the acquisition of concepts rather than actually building and shaping specific skill repertoires. And in those cases where the focus is information sharing or the building of concepts, in most cases, those employ verbal instruction format for training. So let's get back to some ASRs. The basic goal of training is to provide the individual with basic knowledge and skills to perform their functions in a quality manner. Is that true or is that false? So take a second to consider the answer. And of course, the answer is true. The basic goal of training is to provide the skills and knowledge necessary to be able to competent in your job. A set of antecedent and consequent strategies to increase desired performances defines which of the following: performance management, competency-based training, training on how to be a good supervisor, basketball training, or none of the above. And of course, the answer is number one, performance management. One more. Competency-based training is usually done in a sequential manner, not complete until demonstrate competence in an area trained, includes goals and objectives, all of the above, or only option number one. You guys are correct. The answer is all of the above. Performance-based training is showing the individual how to perform target behaviors. No practice is needed. Practice targeted skills under supervision and helps with skill acquisition. And number 5 would be options 1, 3, and 4 are correct. And the answer is number 5, options 1, 3, and 4. Performance-based training shows the individual how to perform the target behaviors, practice targeted skills under supervision, and of course, it helps with skill acquisition. So continuing with this idea of effective training for aspiring behavior analysts or those already in the field at the level of assistant behavior analysts, and registered behavior technicians, we have to consider what are some of the characteristics of successful training programs. So what the literature has suggested for a successful training program, it must account for three specific aspects. Number one, effectiveness. Number two, efficiency and acceptability. So the training needs to be effective. It must yield the results that you're looking for. It must be efficient. It must be done reliably. And of course, also related to the effectiveness. And it must be acceptable by those receiving the training. Consistently successful training programs are effective, efficient, and acceptable. Evidence-based training. So what is this? Every supervisor should be skilled in the delivery of evidence-based training to our supervisees. So we need to know what evidence-based training is. Evidence-based training, of course, as its name actually suggested, it's a system of training or training format which has a strong evidence of effectiveness. It is both performance and competency-based approach to training. So we have goals, objectives that are guiding our training procedures and goals, of course, and it is based on the goals and objectives that we actually set for our supervisees, and of course, it is geared towards the observation of skills and the practice of skills in actually natural settings or job settings. So what are some of the components of an evidence-based training protocol? Number one, we must be able to describe the skills to be trained. So what are going to be the skills, the actual behaviors to be trained? Provide the individual or the supervisee being trained with a written summary of the skills to be trained. So specific definitions of target behaviors in a specific skill chain or in a specific job chain. Demonstrating the skill. We must be able to show our supervisees how to perform the actual target behavior. Have the individual practice performing the target skill and provide performance feedback based on observed observation. So as we have demonstrated the target skill, and which of course may involve also explanations of the skill, we have our participant or provide our supervisees with opportunities for them to practice the skill being modeled. And as they are practicing the skill being modeled, of course, that is an opportunity for us as supervisors to deliver feedback specific to those specific performances. Supported feedback, which may function as a positive reinforcer, for specific correct responses immediately following those correct performances, and corrective feedback for specific skills or responses that are in need of improvement. And of course, we're going to continue steps 1, 3, and 4 until a competence criterion is actually reached. So those would be specifically what we would consider the steps in an evidence-based training protocol. So if we're thinking about an evidence-based training protocol, we have to consider what is often referred to as behavioral skills training. This training approach that is heavily rooted in the principles of applied behavior analysis, which is, of course, a lot of evidence of effectiveness, or an evidence-based training approach. Behavioral skills training are often called BST. So first of all, relating BST to the BACB supervisor and training curriculum outline, what it suggested is the behavioral skills training of the supervisee is a critical feature of supervision. It is our role as supervisors to develop concern for the development of effective skills, the shaping and the fostering of the acquisition of critical skills relevant to their actual practices. Okay. Also, the BACB Experience Standards considers behavioral skills training as a component of effective behavior analytic supervision. The implementation of this training format, or this training protocol approach, if you want to say, will lead actually to the effective acquisition and maintenance, hopefully, of behavior analytic skills in our supervisees. in itself, behavioral skills training has been extensively researched, as I already mentioned, with having evidence of effectiveness in the acquisition of specific skills, variety of skills, in different tasks, of course, or components of different tasks across different populations in a variety of settings. You know, it is a training package which can be considered, of course, a multi-component approach because it is a combination of antecedent and consequence strategies. Antecedent in that skills that occurred prior implementation, and consequence that would actually happen following implementation. As I mentioned, it could serve to train a variety of skills. It has been done to train not only certified, but also non-certified professionals. And it is a procedure for training or an approach to training that is usually pretty scripted. It allows you to identify critical components of training, as well as provide a roadmap for how each specific training component is actually going to be delivered. Actually, there has been a meta-analysis conducted relating it to the current literature, in which 118 single case designs studied or evaluated the effectiveness of BSD specifically with population of teachers. What the results of this meta-analysis suggested was that BSD was associated with the most consistent improvement in implementation fidelity of targeted practices or target behaviors. Now, with that being in consideration, of course, being heavily supported and highly effective at acquiring and maintaining specific skill sets, yet it is not consistently implemented in training programs. And of course, that is really intriguing. So I am going to allow a few minutes, or like, a minute or so, for you to consider why, despite their effectiveness or its effectiveness, BSD effectiveness, it is not consistently implemented in training programs. So please take a second to consider this. And of course, the potential reason for that is going to be explained later as to when we discuss some of the disadvantages or some of the potential disadvantages of implementation of this kind of training. But getting into what really BSD looks like, BSD has some specific components that are included in the training sequence. The 4 main steps in BSD include instructions or instruction delivery and review, the modeling of the target skill, the rehearsal or practice of the target skill, and of course, performance feedback following implementation of target behaviors. So in terms of instructions and or descriptions, as supervisors, first of all, we need to identify components of implementation. And this can be done by developing a task analysis of target skill or target target implementation. As we have defined specific critical components of implementation and we task analyze them, or we break down those tasks into smaller components, we also need to define the specific skills to be taught. What are going to be the specific operational definitions for those target behaviors? And as we define those specific skills, of course, we have to make sure that these definitions are done in a way that can be observed and measured. So our skills selected for acquisition will be done or will be defined in a way that we can actually collect data, first of all, observe them, and be able to distinguish critical aspects of implementation, and of course, collect data or measure those specific responses. It is critical to also provide a rationale for the implementation, for the importance of the skills being trained. So it is not only that we are just going to tell our supervisees what they're being trained on, but also explain to them why the importance, why training on this specific skill or using a specific procedure or etc. is actually important. And in order to accomplish this, there are several things that you can do. You simply have a list of definitions as the example that we have on this slide, or also we can use performance checklists which could actually serve the same purpose as, for instance, the one that we have now in display, which is a simple checklist that could be used also to evaluate fidelity of implementation of certain practices, which clearly states each of the specific components of the target practices with specific definitions. What are the steps, but also what of each step actually looks like. In addition to this, actually, these kinds of materials or resources could also serve as an avenue for feedback delivery, in which our feedback can be maintained or can be kept to be objective by removing the emotion and focusing on specific procedures. Again, looking at the task analysis, it breaks performance down into smaller component steps, and once those have been identified and defined, we're going to use training procedures for teaching and supervision. We should focus on the supervisee's target performance, and making, of course, teaching performances easier. So we want to make sure that instructionally those are manageable and they are done in a sequential manner. We, as supervisors, must create a portfolio of task analysis so that we have resources available already for our supervisees to practice a variety of skills already created. And of course, we want to relate these task analyses and skills that we're training them to actual items on the BACB task list. That is just simply an example of a task analysis for hand washing in this specific case, in which every single component of the task or the behavior chain has actually been broken down. Now, one thing that we could also add to this specific task analysis is specific definitions of target behaviors. And of course, what we see in this specific task analysis is what is actually the discriminative stimulus and what is going to be the response. The storyboard is also something that we must consider when determining the use of behavioral skills training as a training format or training approach. So after we have completed the task analysis, we must consider the use of a storyboard, as I already mentioned. So what is this for? We have to, or what a storyboard really allows us to do is to clearly delineate specifically how we are going to deliver each component of our training package. How am I going to present instructions? When am I going to present instructions? How am I going to review? What language am I going to use to review? How am I going to model the skill or the target behavior? Is it going to be done through live modeling? Is it going to be through video models? Which performances or how many times or how am I going to allow my participant or my supervisee to practice the skill or the target behavior? How am I going to deliver feedback? Which behaviors will contact supportive feedback? Which behaviors will actually contact corrective feedback? All of these things need to be clearly specified prior beginning the process of training. So training design, so basically a storyboard is a training design that prompts us as supervisors or training to identify the specific rationale for performance, instructions for the supervisees, determine how performance will be modeled, practice opportunities or what practice opportunities would actually look like, or the way that we're going to actually have them practice specific target behaviors, how feedback will be delivered, and of course, how are we going to evaluate those specific procedures or performances. This is an example of a storyboard for a specific target performance. So we specify the performance, a specific rationale for the performance. Why is this specific performance important? Important for the client or for the organization, or depending on the job setting of the supervisee or the practicum experience setting of the supervisee. Instruction, what information is going to be included as instructions, how are we going to define, or what are going to be the main components included in our definitions. Modeling, what are going to be some things that I do while modeling, and what are some things that I will say while modeling. As I mentioned before, explanations of the target behavior can actually also be a part of modeling. So what are going to be some things that I'm going to say, and what are going to be some things that I will do? practice. How is the performer going to practice the skill? Feedback, what is going to be feedback? What's going to be accounted for feedback? Again, what specific behaviors are going to contact supportive feedback, or if it functions, if supportive feedback functions as a positive reinforcer, then what behaviors are going to be contacting reinforcement and what behaviors are likely to contact corrective feedback. Following corrective feedback, what is it that am I going to do? Am I going to just simply leave it there? Am I going to provide opportunities for further demonstrations of the skill? How am I going to evaluate and assess the performance of my supervisee in the moment and also towards mastery? And what media, materials am I going to use in order to make the process of training much more effective? So all of these components can be accounted in this idea of the storyboard, which is, again, a planning document basically that will help or assist in the delivery of your training procedures. Instructions, descriptions. Now going into the actual components of BSD. It is critical to provide each trainee with or supervisee with a written description of the target behaviors that constitute the skill. And of course, as I mentioned before, a checklist can actually also serve this function. But here, you're providing clear, detailed descriptions, even with operational definitions of specific target behaviors or sequences. So for example, what we have in front of us is an example of a written description of the multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment. Of course, when looking at instructions and descriptions, it's not just simply a process of providing those to our supervisees and just simply having them figure it out or letting them figure it out. It is a process, of course, in which, if possible, we should review the instructions with them. So allow them the opportunity to access the material by themselves and then provide opportunity for review with them, prior implementation of other antecedent strategies. And this is probably a good time for also answer any questions regarding or any doubts regarding or address any doubts that our supervisees may have regarding what they just read, regarding the specific instructions for implementation of the specific target skill. Once we have provided instructions and we have reviewed the content, review the specifics of the task with our supervisees, now we model the skill, okay? In which we role play interaction between, and this can be done in a form of a role play. This can be done in a form of me pretending, as a supervisor, me pretending to perform the skill. I could have an additional individual, which would allow me to role play the specific skill interaction between, or it could be something that could be done between the supervisor and the supervisee actually. So a role play interaction between the supervisor and supervisee. It is usually done prior in performance. It is also called it is called an antecedent strategy, or considered an antecedent strategy. One thing is that we have to make sure that we model the behavior multiple times so that the participant has a clear picture of what the skill really looks like and what it also doesn't look like. Involves also explanations, as I already mentioned, of the steps modeled. This idea is based on observational learning. And of course, we not only should focus or it's live modeling. It's not the only option that we currently have. We could actually take performances or use video and use those video models in order to also model that specific target performance. Modeling, very important. And perhaps, of course, modeling the skill is really important, but what most important perhaps is that the person doing the modeling is a competent performer of the target behavior. If you're not a competent performer of the target behavior, do not model the skill. It will foster rehearsal actually of the incorrect target behavior. And you're gonna end up shaping up and providing feedback on incorrect behavioral performances, which is going to be detrimental to the process of learning of our supervisees. Only model skills that you're competent to train on. Just taking it back or just taking you back to this idea of competence in supervision, same here, same in this specific area. We're only gonna be able to or we are only going to model skills that we're competent to perform, or we have been, or we are competent to actually provide training on. Skills rehearsal, which is perhaps, a critical piece in this training. Rehearsal means practice, 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 and I won't get tired emphasizing the word practice and practice and practice and practice, because it allows us to provide feedback, strengthening specific performances. This is a critical feature of the training, the provision of practice opportunities to the trainee, in which the trainee practices the target skill along in combination with performance feedback. Again, support feedback for correct performances and corrective feedback for performances that may be in need of improvement. And of course, we want to make sure that not only one opportunity for skill rehearsal is provided, that we actually provide our supervisees with multiple opportunities to achieve mastery and fluency of the target behavior, So someone may ask, Miguel, how many times do you actually allow the participant to rehearse until a specific training criterion has actually reached? So that may be 2, 3, so that may be accomplished within 2 or 3 rehearsal and feedback trials, or it could be, but many more, So we have to make sure that prior implementation of the target behavior with the actual client in the natural setting, we make sure that our trainee, our supervisee, is able to competently perform the skill during training. Performance feedback, which of course has been suggested as a critical component in professional development in adults. It has been suggested that it can function as a positive reinforcement, and or be delivered in ways to correct incorrect performances. It is usually conceptualized as a consequence of performance, in which aspects of someone's performance is actually discussed. Usually when performance feedback is occurring, we're providing information to specific aspects of certain implementations. It actually includes a specific or a very explicit reference to the work performance of concern, plus an evaluative summary of the staff's work. So to make some points clear here regarding performance feedback, it is not so much about the evaluation, which may account for some emotional responses. It is also in the descriptive aspect of performance feedback that will allow the participant to come into contact with actually what correct implementation would actually look like. It is the most researched staff training strategy. It has been suggested as a very effective, an evidence-based practice, very effective at increasing implementation fidelity of targeted practices. And it is most effective when delivered immediately after performances. It's likely to yield positive outcomes. It follows performances directly. In addition to feedback, we want to make sure that we provide feedback to the supervisee as they practice the performance skill, following specific target performances or target behaviors, provide individualized, supportive, and corrective feedback, so not only strengthen or not only focus on the aspects of implementation that are actually not going right, but also focus on those that are actually going well and strengthen those through the use of performance feedback. And remember, of course, to keep your ratio of negatives and positives, which sort of like relates to what I just mentioned. Sometimes when we conceptualize, when we think of the implementation of feedback, we think of, I have to correct incorrect performances. Yes, but also I have to maintain the ones that are actually occurring that are correct. So you want to keep a ratio of your positive and negatives. Keeping too negative or keeping a higher ratio of negative feedback or being too consistent with negative feedback or corrective feedback may actually impact some components of the supervisory relationship, as my colleague Jolene actually suggested earlier in this presentation. So for example, what we have in front of us is a specific example of the kind of feedback, the method of delivery, as well as what it looks like and when should we use it. So for example, vocal verbal feedback, which is the most widely used form of delivery feedback delivery, which is delivering vocal feedback about performance to the supervisee. And when should we use it? We should use it after a performance in situ or in a meeting. Another type of feedback could be video feedback, and this doesn't mean that you will deliver feedback via video. It would be the performances that have been recorded, that actually allow us to provide feedback if we were not able to, in this specific context, a specific performance has been recorded that would allow us to perform feedback based on the recording. So it would not mean that feedback is actually delivered through some form of video or something like that. So again, video showing the supervisee a video of his or her performance, which of course is typically includes vocal feedback, and self-checking. And this can be done in the context of a meeting, like a supervisory meeting, where you guys are reviewing specific aspects of performance. Yet another one, graphic, providing the supervisee, graphic feedback, providing the supervisee with a graphic display of their performance, and which is usually done in a one-to-one kind of meeting, which in some cases it's been shown to be really effective to improve specific performances. Seeing how you're doing on a graph may actually become really, really function as a reinforcer. Thus increasing behavior, of course. So what are some types of feedback, which we have already been talking about for a few minutes or for a few seconds? Vocal verbal, as mentioned, something that, it's a type of feedback delivery method that is most widely used. Written feedback, which can be the form of a supervision note or a performance note or an email describing aspects of performance. Graphic feedback, as I mentioned, the use of pictures, symbols, or graphs depicting specific performances. Technology-based feedback, email, computer-assisted feedback, even the use of specific technologies that would aid in the feedback delivery, such as there has been a specific transmitters that actually allow for trainers to deliver feedback in the moment as performances are actually occurring. So what about delayed feedback, or this idea of delayed feedback versus delayed video feedback? Of course, delayed feedback would be least in our recommendations because, as mentioned before, feedback is most likely or is more likely to have an impact on performances if delivered immediately following those specific target behaviors. So the more delayed, the provision of feedback, the less likely it would have an impact on implementation. Now, this idea of delayed video feedback is exactly what I was explaining before. It should not be confused with this idea of feedback being delayed. Yes, it is delayed, but actually through a video, we are able to capture aspects of implementation or specific performances and being able to use vocal verbal feedback to provide feedback based on those recordings. Now, it is a viable option. It is a helpful option because when compared with in situ kind of feedback, delayed video feedback may allow us to capture aspects of implementation that live observations may actually, or that in live observation we could probably miss. So it may actually account for a better way perhaps to deliver feedback, in a supervisory meeting, et cetera, et cetera. However, of course, it may also have its drawbacks because, you have to use specific technologies, specific resources, which may not be available at specific workplaces. And again, it may not allow you to practice specific skills in the actual moment, perhaps with the actual client. Critical in behavioral skills training, and of course, this is perhaps a component that gets left out in more or in more implementations that are implementations of BST that are a little more loosely implemented. Supervisors should actually establish a mastery criterion such as supervisees performing at 100% of target steps or certain steps with 100% proficiency. The observation of the competence in performing the target skill. So this is sometimes done prior implementation with actual clients. So technically speaking, what we will try to do is make sure that we get the supervisee or the trainee to a level of proficiency that is highly acceptable before they actually deliver the skill or practice the skill with the actual client or the actual students in the actual classroom, um, um, in the actual natural setting. So these steps of feedback, modeling, rehearsal and feedback, model and rehearsal and feedback, with rehearsal and feedback really being emphasized, should actually happen until a specific training criterion has actually been met. So prior in our considerations of the details of our training, we need to consider what is going to be criteria that our supervisees will need to reach prior than being exposed to performing the skill in the actual regular real setting with the actual client, etc. So what are some of the advantages of the use of behavioral skills training? Well, of course, there is a lot of evidence of effectiveness. It is comprehensive. It is effective across settings. Demonstrations of effectiveness of behavioral skills training has been conducted in educational, human service, clinical, residential settings, and even industrial settings. It focuses on the relevant skills that a behavior analytic, that a new behavior analyst must acquire. So relevant to skills, behavior analytics skills to practice in the actual job setting or during supervision for the supervisee. So it focuses on skills. It's really, really geared towards acquisition and maintenance of skills. Eliminates concerns of regarding generalization and its multi-component nature. Maybe what's necessary to actually achieve optimal levels of implementation of performances. So all of these are advantages of behavioral skills training, of course. What are some disadvantages? As any technology, of course, it has limitations. Which one of them may be that it may only involve one staff member at a time. So you may only be able to train one staff member at a time. In addition to that, it may be difficult to implement due to the real interfering conditions in the actual natural setting. So think of it, think of the implementation of behavioral skills training in a classroom per se, in a special education classroom, where you have 3 or 4 staff to train, but you have a ratio, you have 8 to 9 students of different skill levels. How do I manage my training plus my teaching plus my keeping a healthy instructional environment? So in some cases, its intensity and its multi-component nature, its comprehensive nature may actually compromise the feasibility of supervisee training. And also, we need to consider that, depending on the responsibilities of the supervisor, especially if, the supervisor and the supervisee relation actually takes place in the job place or in the job setting of the supervisor, where the supervisor also has multiple other responsibilities. So that is something very important to consider, and time efficiency. In some cases, how long would this take me to actually get my supervisee or my trainee to actually read a specific training criterion, before they can actually implement it. So there have been multiple implementations of behavioral skills training or variations of the implementation of behavioral skills training, which may actually not take into account specific components that may be critical in implementation, and of course be critical in the entire effectiveness of the process. So ideally, when implementing BST, consider operational definitions of correct performances, of course. Number 2, making sure that those definitions focus on observable and measurable target skills, or defining target skills in a way that we can actually describe and distinguish specific aspects, critical aspects of implementation, as well as making sure that those aspects are measurable. Use task analysis in order to sequence, identify critical component or component skills, and to sequence our training. Chain and shape supervisee's performance, identify critical SDs and terminal outcomes, as well as use a storyboard for planning, which will provide you ideas, or which provide you with a roadmap with respect to rationales, instructions, how will performance be modeled, practice opportunities, feedback, and mastery. continue skill practice with antecedent and consequence components until actually the supervisee or the trainee has actually reached a specific training criterion. So now I am going to show you a video that relates specifically to the implementation of behavioral skills training in the supervision process.
Behavioral skills training, or BST, is a procedure for teaching new skills. BST is a useful tool for training adult learners and is a required procedure of supervision. The four initial components of BST are as follows: introduction of the skill, skill demonstration, opportunity to practice, feedback. Skill demonstration, opportunity to practice, and feedback are repeated until mastery is observed. Here a supervisor is introducing the skill of writing a behavioral plan to a pre-certification supervisee.
Okay, James, for today's meeting, I want to provide training for creating a data sheet. During your internship, you've come in contact with many data sheets created by others. As new behavior support plans are developed, I'd like to see you create the necessary documents for implementing those plans, and data sheets will be a big part of that.
I'm up for that.
Great. Now, when we set up this meeting, I asked you to read the Cooper, Heron, and Heward textbook, Chapter 4, Measuring Behavior. Were you able to get to that?
Yes, I brought my text and some notes.
Good. Many of the procedures described in that chapter should already be familiar with you. What content from the chapter was less familiar to you?
The supervisor introduced the skill with a textbook reading. Readings from text and journal articles are a nice way to introduce skills because they allow the supervisee to review the material prior to the training. The supervisor continues with the introduction of the skill.
Those are just some examples. Was I clear on the difference in practical applications of duration and latency recording?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The toilet training example really helped me too.
Great. Now, I have a procedural checklist for you of what I expected from the data sheet development. Let's take a moment and go over it together.
The supervisor uses the procedural checklist to introduce the steps in completing the skill. The criteria for creating a data sheet are listed down the left column, and the evaluation markings are made in the columns to the right. There is also a place for notes so that the supervisor may provide descriptive feedback.
You can keep that copy and use it as a guide when you're creating data sheets. I will also be using the procedural checklist to provide feedback on the data sheets you create.
Okay, thank you.
I have some exemplar data sheets here. These data sheets include all the criteria from the procedural checklist. There's one for each type of data collection that we will be covering. Please take a minute and review those now.
When training how to create a written document, consider providing exemplar examples as the skill demonstration.
These are great. I noticed that the momentary time sampling data sheet we use for one of the residents on my caseload is formatted differently than this example. Is it okay if I make formatting changes to these examples?
Yes, that is fine. It is the best to keep the data sheet to one-page length, but otherwise, small changes in the formatting should be fine. Now, I would like to provide you with an opportunity to practice a skill. There is a resident on your caseload, Stephen, who has been displaying new behavior. I want you to create a momentary time sampling data sheet that the staff can use all day. Bring it by my office this afternoon, and we will go over it. How does that sound?
Sounds good. I'll work on it today and bring it by this afternoon.
Hey, James.
Hello. I'm coming by with that momentary time sampling data sheet.
Great. Do you have the procedural checklist from earlier?
Yes, I do.
I'm going to look over the data sheet that you created and see which of the criteria were included and if anything was left out. You can do the same and we can compare.
The supervisor is asking the supervisee to self-assess his data sheet using the procedural checklist.
Did you have an opportunity to mark a rating for all the criteria?
Yes.
Now we will compare our ratings to see where we agree and where we differ. We both agree the instructions for collecting data were omitted.
Yeah, I forgot those.
Otherwise, it looks like we agree that all of the other criteria were included. I would like to continue to give you opportunities to practice creating forms for data collection.
Okay, that was fun, so I don't mind making some more.
When you've created 3 different data collection sheets with 100% of the criteria met on procedural checklist, we will move on to the in vivo generalization probes. For the in vivo generalization probes, you will find your own opportunities to create data sheets for the residents on your caseload. I will check in to look them over as they are created.
Following a few successful in vivo probes, the supervisor will put the skill on maintenance. She will continue to check on the data sheets created by the supervisee in about a month, and then about a month or 2 after that to determine whether the supervisee's data sheets continue to meet all the criteria of the procedural checklist.
So as we could see in the video, the trainer or the supervisor in this case employed multiple methods in order to provide instructions and review those instructions with the supervisee, model the skill to be trained, which in this case was creating data sheets, opportunities for the supervisee to practice the skill with assistance, with feedback, and this continued until a specific mastery criterion was actually reached. In addition to that, we were able to see that there was an attempt to continue or to monitor performance once mastery criteria was actually reached. So on ASR, the components of PST include, number 1, instructions, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback. Number 2, modeling, feedback, and rehearsal. Number 3, feedback and modeling. Number 4, instructions only. So please take a second to consider the answer. And of course, the answer is number 1, instructions, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback. When modeling, you must consider which of the following. Number 1, being a competent with skill being modeled. Number 2, it is an antecedent strategy. Number 3, explain steps being modeled. And number 4, all of the above. And of course, the answer is number 4, all of the above. When modeling, we must consider that, one must be a competent performer of the target skill, that modeling in itself is an antecedent strategy, and as we model, we can always explain the steps being modeled. One more. Advantages of BST include, number 1, the generalization of skills. Number 2, relevant skills to be trained in the actual natural environments. Number 3, get ready or get really good at watching someone. Number 4, evidence of effectiveness across setting. Or number 5, 1, 2, and 4 are actually correct options. And of course, those of you who have number 5 are correct. Number 1, generalization of skills, or it assists with the generalization of skills or reduces concerns with generalization of skills is actually correct. Number 2, it focuses on relevant skills in the actual natural environment. And number 4, it is a training strategy or program that actually has a lot of evidence of effectiveness across settings. Among some of the disadvantages of PST, we must include which of the following. Number 1, no disadvantages. The model is perfect. Number 2, time efficiency. Number 3, involves only one staff member at a time. Number 4, may actually interfere with conditions in the actual natural setting, or like, for instance, additional supervisor responsibility. And number 5, Number 2, 3, and 4 are actually the correct options. So please take a second to consider the answer. And you are correct. The answer is number 5. Time efficiency is a concern. The fact that it may involve only one staff member can also be a concern or a disadvantage. And additionally, implementation of this kind of training may actually interfere with conditions that occur actually in the natural environment. So as we have mentioned that PSD is actually a really effective training program or training procedure or protocol, we also need to consider the efficiency of training, especially after having reviewed some of the potential disadvantages of PSD, one of them being the efficiency, time efficiency. So the research has actually evaluated alternative methods that have included not all, but some of the components, perhaps an evaluation of some of the most critical components in this training sequence. And of course, you know, in attempts to increase the feasibility of our, you know, training of our trainees or the training of our supervisees in settings in which implementation of a more comprehensive training strategy such as BSD may actually compromise the training occurring. So what's been evaluated, as I said, are, you know, alternative methods or abbreviations of the original model, which may be less rigorous, but also may increase the efficiency and its practicality, and that have also resulted in effective outcomes for trainees. Some of those abbreviated or alternative methods have included the delivery of feedback, vocal, verbal, plus review of instructions, which has been effective at increasing implementation fidelity, specifically in the case of LeBlanc and colleagues, at increasing peer educators' implementation of steps to deliver discrete trial training. Feedback and rehearsal has also been evaluated by Gilligan and colleagues in 2007, in which they successfully trained also paraeducators or classroom assistants to deliver discrete trial training. Modeling and feedback has also been evaluated. Not only live modeling, but also video modeling has been evaluated with showing effective results and reduced training time, or, you know, also reduced sessions to actually reach mastery. Verbal and written feedback, combination of feedback approaches have also been found effective. And of course, in a comparison of, in a functional analysis of BSD components, actually after feedback, Horner and Sturmy, what they found was that modeling was actually the most effective. However, with that being said, what it has also been suggested is that we need to take into account the nature of the target skill. So other components, depending on the target skill, of course, may actually be as effective at modeling, or perhaps more effective than modeling. So what are some advantages of perhaps these less rigorous, more efficient, and equally effective models? Well, they're practical, they're feasible, they increase the feasibility of training, especially in settings that have difficult dynamics. They may not require extended time commitment. We can make them focus on procedures, and they can be easily incorporated into applied settings or in the context of a job setting, you know, considering all of the components or all of the factors that we have already suggested. What may be some of the disadvantages? Of course, I mean, they're less rigorous. In order to see more effective results or optimal levels of implementation, the comprehensive or multi-component approach of this training of PSD may actually be necessary to reach optimal levels of implementation. I may not emphasize on critical components needed for acquisition of fluency may not produce durable effects. So they may actually be effective at producing or at, you know, at assisting or fostering the acquisition of the target skill. However, will those skills actually maintain over time? And the research on complex skill sets in relation to abbreviated or alternative methods is actually very limited. So of course, more research is needed in this specific area. So what are some final considerations regarding training efficiency? Of course, we know that multi-component strategies or approaches are very effective. Perhaps what's needed to reach optimal levels of implementation in optimal circumstances, given that they may include multiple antecedents strategies and consequent strategies such as performance feedback being ideal for establishing skill repertoires or skill sets and also maintaining those. And of course, I mean, we must consider those when resources and time are available. Those specific approaches such as behavioral skills training should be our first consideration. However, we should also become aware of training alternatives that focus on skill acquisition that are perhaps more efficient and that may produce equally effective results, especially when resources and time are limited, you know, when supervisors provide supervision in the context of other job responsibilities, when the supervisory relationship between the supervisor and supervisee actually happen in the work setting of the supervisor, when considering, you know, of course, as I mentioned, the increased responsibilities of the supervisor or the complexities due to the naturalistic setting. You know, for example, a special education classroom where, you know, there is multiple dynamics actually, or multiple contingencies actually occurring that may actually influence or impact the feasibility of training of those in need of training. So now what I will do is I will hand it over to my colleague Jolene so that we can continue with specific aspects of the supervision relationship or the supervisory relationship, specifically the use of positive reinforcement in supervision, which is a critical component.
Okay, so now we're going to go into, as Miguel said, a little bit more detail related to the supervisory experience with the use of positive reinforcement and the importance of the interpersonal skills. So we want to make sure that we are using the principles of applied behavior analysis and the use of positive reinforcement in the supervision, because what we know about positive reinforcement is that it will increase the likelihood of those behaviors in the future. So if we select targeted behaviors for our supervisees and they have mastered those and we reinforce those, the likelihood of those continuing post-supervisory experience increases, right? So we want to make sure that we are giving a lot of effort into this. We also want to make sure that we are working with our aspiring behavior analysts and showing them the value of what it is that they're doing. The great amount of the time learning the role of reinforcement and developing these repertoires for our clients and our students, because we know how valuable reinforcement can be in the future likelihood of the behaviors in the future. We want to make sure we show some appreciation for how these reinforcement procedures will improve the lives of the individuals that we serve, both the supervisees as well as the clients and students and consumers that our supervisees will be working with in the future. So remembering that positive reinforcement makes the supervision process more successful and socially valid for everyone. How many times or what rate do we use positive reinforcement in our supervisory practices or our supervision practices is a question we need to ask ourselves as the supervisor. Really, you know, often people will say, sure, I reinforce all the time, I praise them all the time, but really maybe we need to take a moment and measure that and actually tally throughout our supervision meetings or throughout our observations or throughout the performance monitoring using the behavior skills training that Miguel talked to you about, how often are we providing positive reinforcement to our supervisees? And the more often we are reinforcing those targeted behaviors, the more likely they're going to occur in the future and the more positive and successful the relationship will be between the supervisor and the supervisee. So it's just something to always be really mindful of, and you can actually take a direct measure if needed. Okay. When you look at the role of positive reinforcement and what you could be using in your practices, praise would be one to begin with, right? But we want to make sure, as in the Daniels article, it states that praise should be sincere, direct, but caring. So we want to be able to be sincere of what we're saying to the supervisee. That was a really nice job. using the data systems for your analysis, being specific, being immediate, and being personal. So just using a good job and telling them every 2 weeks that what they're doing well, isn't going to be as effective as if we can be immediate right when we're providing that skills training opportunity, and we can be personal with the supervisee that we're working with. Being creative, so using things other than just praise is helpful. So what are some things that you could do? Potentially, you can have articles already printed out for your supervisee. Although this sounds so simple, any little workload that we can help, like, great job this week, I already pre-printed your articles, here you go. You have a checklist provided for them, modeling things in advance so that they can then use those same samples in the future, are all ways to kind of be creative. You're still staying within the limits of your supervisory relationship, but you're reinforcing them in a way that's creative, in a way that shows them a level of professionalism that you can model, and hope that in the future they're able to use some of those same types of creative measures and those different ways that you were praising them with future supervisee-supervisor relationships. Positive reinforcement increases the frequency of the technical and related professional behaviors in the supervisees, and it improves your quality of supervision. Advantages of training the efficiency include, so this is your next ASR, 1, practical, 2, procedure-based, 3, does not require extended time commitment, 4, all of the above, 5, none of the above. You got it. It's number 4, all of the above. All right, our next ASR, positive reinforcement in supervision. 1, uses praise as a positive reinforcer. 2, makes supervision process more successful. 3, uses punishers every time the supervisee gets it wrong. 4, is socially valid for everyone. 5, 1, 2, and 4. That's right, number 5, 1, 2, and 4. It uses praise as a positive reinforcer, makes supervision more successful, and is socially valid for everyone. Ongoing performance and monitoring. Behavior analysis really is, remember, is not only the science of learning, it's in the acquisition of skills, it's understanding the variables that increase or maintain the behavior after it's established. Once supervisors have trained the skills for our supervisees, we need to make sure that that performance remains accurate and fluent, and that we've reached optimal levels of implementation. So once we've met our targeted skills and we've met our mastery criteria, we also need to make sure that these skills maintain over time, that the supervisee becomes more fluent in performing these skills and maintaining their level of accuracy. In the BACB experience standards, it states the supervisee's primary focus should be acquiring new behavior analytic skills related to the BACB task list. And once again, you can reference that task list online. And supervisees also must maintain satisfactory performance after new skills are established. So that's what I was just referencing in terms of, we want them to acquire new skills, but we also want to make sure once those new skills are established and learned, that they are maintained at a level of fluency and accuracy over time, and then can be used and generalized across settings. Supervisors are required to observe their supervisees in the natural environment at least once per supervisory period, or based on the type of supervision experience that had been selected. And you can reference that back to the beginning of the presentation and going back to your BACB website and looking up your experience standards. The advantages of the in vivo observations for ongoing performance monitoring include really being able to observe that application, which will then increase the likelihood of the generalization of the skill for the supervisee. It provides an opportunity on the job for us to provide corrective feedback if needed, or support and positive reinforcement of the skill that they demonstrated. And then it allows for continued performance for skill maintenance over time. Appropriate data systems must also be established for ongoing performance monitoring. The supervisors and managers who are part of this process should collect data to determine the level of knowledge that the supervisees and trainees were able to perform. And so what data systems they select to measure that will be a way to determine if we've met our outcomes and received our target and achieved our targeted behaviors. We also want to look at treatment fidelity. And we know that treatment fidelity is the extent to which an intervention is delivered as intended or planned. It is important in our research and our practice that we are using some type of measure to determine if we are following all the steps intended for the intervention as well as other components. It's essential to making valid conclusions regarding the training outcomes or intervention's effectiveness. And it helps us to look at it, whether it be using the treatment fidelity. Now we know that it's assessed on those steps and not just assumed if the individual was able to implement the various steps in the fidelity checklist. The dimensions in which we can look at when looking at treatment fidelity would be adherence or content, meaning what intervention steps were delivered, quantity, how much of the intervention was provided, quality, how well the intervention steps were delivered, and the process, how the intervention was delivered. So what do you think is the relationship between the assessment of treatment fidelity and the training? So when you think about this question, you should be really thinking about the fact that the feedback incorporated into training should directly address the dimensions of the treatment fidelity. In your opinion, what is the most commonly assessed dimension of treatment fidelity? Often it is adherence. But when we look at adherence, we know we're just looking at the steps that were delivered, but we're missing the overall intervention related to the quantity, the quality, and the process, the overall big picture. And so if we only look at the content in the dimensions, then we're missing some of the other very critical pieces in the fidelity of implementation. Here are a few samples for the treatment fidelity assessments, one of these being the checklist model. So you can see here, if a supervisee was to follow the steps for intensive teaching, it is listed here out the 16 steps that they would need to follow. And then the observer, the supervisor, would look into seeing which steps were followed at 100% and then determining how many steps they were able to complete all together and being able to provide very specific feedback on what steps were followed, what steps were missed, and then provide training in the areas that were needed. Here's another training model checklist fidelity checklist that really looks at the steps in potentially a behavior protocol of escape extinction. So here you can see it breaks it down into 7 simple steps, very easy for the observer to determine is the supervisee following the steps when working with their client. Another one related to manned training. So really the way to look at these different checklist model is that anything can be broken down into the steps needed in order to complete the entire targeted behavior. And then from these different skill sets that are broken down, we then can provide training opportunities for our supervisee and give them direct feedback and potentially have to pull out some of the targeted skills to reach mastery before completing the entire checklist. Some additional data systems that could be used would be even a rubric to help determine if skills are being met and if interventions are being run with fidelity. This can be used to ensure the development of targeted skills for acquisition. They ensure proficiency and maintenance of the skills already in the supervisee's repertoire, and they look at skills related to accuracy and fluency. What's important to know is that when you are working on completing a rubric or fidelity checklist, that you've already taught your supervisee the steps needed, and now you're seeing when it's all put together, are they able to complete the entire checklist with fidelity? Here's a sample of the rubric where the skills are broken down, and then the data system for measuring your supervisee would be a simple plus and minus. So evaluating the fidelity of the supervisor is just as critical. So we just showed you guys some demonstrations on how you would look at the fidelity of what your supervisee is doing, but just as important, we need to make sure that as supervisors, we are seeking out the support that we need to make sure that we're providing the experience and training needed for our supervisee. The training intervention should also evaluate and monitor the extent in which the supervisor or the professionals in the position of training is delivering the training as intended. This can be done by a second observer who's also trained in that area and is familiar with those training procedures, and then can provide ongoing evaluation and training support for the supervisor. Here is a sample of a fidelity checklist for a supervisor. So while the supervisor is giving feedback to the supervisee, there can be another observer looking to see, are the steps being followed by the supervisor to provide the supervisee with the most evidence-based practices and feedback that would be most successful for them to learn a new skill and to maintain the skills that they have been taught. Treatment fidelity data is really a nice way to look at our evaluating performance and to determine if skills that we have selected as targeted skills have been met. They must serve as a discriminative stimuli for the instructional behavior. A supervisor should consider changes in the instructional approach if no progress is made by the supervisee. So that simply means if we are looking at a treatment fidelity checklist and the supervisee is always missing steps 11 through 15 across many different sessions, even following some training opportunities provided with research and information in a supervision session, then we need to look at, do we need to change our instructional approach? Do we need to change the way in which we're providing the feedback to our supervisee to make it more effective for them, and making sure that we are always evaluating the effectiveness of our training and interventions. Here's another ASR. In ongoing performance monitoring, 1, supervisors observe supervisee in the natural environment. 2, all observations occur remotely. 3, it does not matter to observe. 4, the type of supervision experience is irrelevant. And 5, the only answer is number 1. You are correct. The answer for this ASR is number 5, indicating the answer is only selected for number 1. Supervisors observe supervisee in the natural environment. Here's another ASR. Treatment fidelity in ongoing performance monitoring will 1, help to ensure that an intervention is delivered as intended. 2, important methodological concern in research and practice. 3, allows to make valid conclusions on training outcomes and intervention effectiveness. And 4, all of the above. That's correct. It's number 4, all of the above. It will help to ensure that the intervention is delivered as intended. Remember the different steps, the adherence, the quality, quantity, and process. It is important in the methodological concern in our research and practice. We need to make sure we have this type of system in place in order for us to make decisions, and it helps us to really determine our outcomes and intervention effectiveness. Number ASR, number 3, let's try this one out. The dimensions of treatment fidelity include, number 1, adherence, good faith, good observations, and process. 2, quantity and quality. 3, adherence, process, quantity, quality. 4, none of the above. That's right, it's number 3. Adherence, process, quantity, and quality are the dimensions of treatment fidelity. Okay, so to review the process of supervision, we need to remember some of the things that we've talked about throughout this training. 1 being establishing that supervisory relationship from the very beginning. That included having our contracts put together, determining ways in which feedback will be given, a skills assessment to see what training needs are most needed throughout the supervision experience. How are we going to prioritize high and low training needs? We can use our job model to help select the training needs initially and then move into all types of trainings that would help them to become a very well-rounded supervisee. We look at goal setting and creating competencies, really making sure that the supervisee understands how they're going to meet their goals, which competencies they need to meet by using different mastery criteria in order to demonstrate the skill. The ongoing training and the ongoing performance monitoring are critical steps for the process of supervision. And like I mentioned, we're going to get into, towards the end of the training, how do we end that supervisory relationship? How do we evaluate the supervisee's overall skill development, the evaluation of the supervisor's effectiveness, and the professional development planning for the future? Why are these all so important to review for the process of supervision? Because they directly relate to ethics. And we know ethics are critical when providing supervision to our supervisees. One, so that we are modeling best practices, and two, so that we are making sure that we have ethical considerations as a supervisor-supervisee relationship, as well as when providing services to our clients and consumers. The field of behavior analysis relies heavily on supervision to shape and maintain the skills of our professionals. Remembering a behavior analyst as a supervisor is a key role in following the ethical compliance code for behavior analysis. It really is a nice way to make sure that you are following all of the code of ethics related to the BACB as a supervisor and as a professional in the field. Our supervisory practices are not only impacting the supervisees when we think about ethical considerations. We know that as a supervisor and as a behavior analyst in the field, when we are providing this type of supervision, we are directly affecting our consumers because we are giving our supervisees skills and training that they need when working with our consumers. So if we are not running these with ethical practices, we can be directly affecting our consumers. Implications for the field, we want to make sure that we're using best practices and ethical considerations and modeling when working with our supervisees. We are helping to shape future behavior analysts, and the critical piece of that is keeping ethics in the forefront of all of our decision making and future consumers. So we just want to make sure that ethics is the central guide in our decision making as behavior analysts in this role as a supervisor and in the role as a behavior analyst, because we know it impacts so many other components of the process. Developing understanding of the BACB code of ethics and consequence to failure to adhere to the code is important because it really helps deepen our understanding of the rules, the regulations, and the conditions related to our science. There is a whole section on the BACB that relates directly to this code of ethics, and supervisors must take full responsibility for all aspects of this undertaking. So really understanding that code of ethics and understanding how you're going to use that in your supervision duties. You want to make sure you take these very seriously and have a full understanding of the requirements and responsibilities, and of course read and reread over and over again the section of the code before beginning your supervision process. So we also want to make sure within this code of ethics that we understand that the supervisory competence is critical. We do not want to be providing supervision in areas that we aren't competent in. If we don't have the skill set in the area that our supervisee needs training, then we need to make referrals, we need to get training in that area, or we need to seek consultation from other behavior analysts in the field that are competent in those areas so that we can better provide training to our supervisees. This helps to protect our consumers, our supervisees, and the field of behavior analysis as a whole. Okay, so not only do we need to be competent, we also need to be culturally competent in the field of behavior analysis. We need to be able to take on issues that could happen with our consumers if we have interventions in place that may not match the cultural needs of that family. We need to be able to take that into consideration because it is our responsibility under the BACB Code of Ethics that we are culturally competent, and that we are receiving training and providing supervision for others to become culturally competent. In the Beilu article, a variety of BCBAs were surveyed to assess their training and knowledge in cultural competence, and the results showed that the training, that the BCBAs felt the training on cultural competence was extremely important. They felt moderately comfortable and skilled working with diverse populations, yet there was little to no training in this area that was part of the results in this article. So how could we say that we're trained and we're culturally competent when we are also saying that we have no training in this area? That's a big concern, to say that we're competent, but also in the same survey say that we hadn't received training. We need to make sure that if we're competent, it's because of the training that we have received, and making sure that we are receiving the information to be able to provide services to diverse cultural backgrounds. The BACB has adopted guidelines on working with clients from diverse cultural backgrounds. There have been revisions made to the task list to incorporate cultural diversity in our trainings. And we also know that behavior analysts, as behavior analysts, we need to continue to seek out training in this area with literature, and we need to make sure that our supervisors must be competent in these areas so that we can better assist our supervisees. Another area to look at in the ethics of supervision would be the supervisory volume. How much are we taking on here? Is it measurable? Do we have too much in place? Is it too large for us to provide the supervisees the type of high quality, effective supervision that we have agreed to in our initial contract? The ethical behavior analyst supervision must consider supervisory volume, because we know that this can compromise the development of adequate skill development and repertoires in our supervisees, and can be harmful for the supervisee in the field of behavior analysis, because they weren't able to be provided with the supervision they need based off of our supervisory volume. Another area to consider in the ethics would be the supervisory delegation, right? It's critical for the supervisor to know if the supervisee has the prerequisite skills to carry out a given task. We cannot delegate for our supervisees to perform a task if we have not given them the skill set needed to carry that out. And we know that if we do not give them that skill set and we then delegate, we then are at risk of harming our consumers that are receiving these services. So we need to make sure that we first check that before we begin delegating out the different responsibilities. Allowing a supervisee to carry out a task for which no adequate skill set is developed would be putting us at an ethical risk. It's critical for the supervisor to have knowledge of which skills can be independent and which ones cannot. And then that way we are not putting anybody at risk of skills that are not at a level of mastery when running it with our consumers. We need to make sure that we're designing effective supervision and training that's evidence-based and best practices using the principles of behavior analysis. This will increase the probability of achieving optimal outcomes as the supervisee-supervisor relationship and as our supervisee moves into the field independently. It provides specific disciplinary requirements describing effective and evidence-based supervision, effective and ethical methods to reach the goals, and comply with both professional and legal mandates. Designing effective supervision and training also requires in the supervision role that the research is evidence-based and that it keeps evolving, that we're part of ongoing review, and that literature must be included into the supervision practices, and the supervisor responsibility stay up to date with the advances in the training and supervision, so that we are always reviewing the latest research so that we can then share that information with our supervisees and providing that effective training ongoing. The communication of the supervision conditions, we know that there can be, this is a critical piece in our supervision experience because the ongoing communication is critical. We have to make sure that this allows for both parties to make informed agreements and to proceed with their relationship through the communication process. And if you fail to do this, then it really makes expectations unclear. It makes the expectations hard to follow and will potentially create a supervisee mismatch. And the disagreement and incorrect perceptions of these expectations will then affect the nature of the relationship and the ability to implement with fidelity. Providing feedback is another component of our ethics of supervision, and we know that this is critical, and we've talked about this throughout the presentation, using that positive reinforcement and the corrective feedback as essential components for the supervision process. Design systems based on the behavior analytic principles that aim at obtaining the desired effects, shaping, and acquisition of skills. The failure to use this effective feedback and the positive reinforcement will be harmful in the acquisition of skills and may then have effects on your supervision practices. Evaluating the effects of supervision. Supervision can be evaluated at 3 levels: at the consumer performance, the staff performance, and the supervisor performance. The supervisor must be able to assess the supervision activities effective at establishing the supervisory relationship, increase in supervisory skills and knowledge base, and establishing a relation between the supervisory practices and the consumer outcomes. Continuing to evaluate the effects of supervision, we need to make sure that if we do not do this, the failure to evaluate the effects of supervision provided would then provide an inability to replicate effective practices, the provision of ineffective supervision, and unknowingly provide damaging supervision, doing harm to the current supervisee and the consumers. Let's look at some important factors in incorporating ethical training into supervision. We need to remember that throughout the process as a supervisor, we are also taking on the role of teaching ethics to our supervisees. Ethical dilemmas present the most challenging aspect of a new graduate's career or recent certificate. We know that daily we can be faced with ethical dilemmas, and we need to provide those opportunities and those conversations throughout the supervision experience based off something that the current supervisee is facing, or making sure we have the conversation of things that potentially could come up when out in the field so that your supervisee is prepared to deal with ethical dilemmas ongoing to make best decisions and best practices. Supervisors should address and directly shape ethical and development of the supervisees during the supervision process. In the BACB compliance code, it states that behavior analysts must effectively work to establish and foster a culture that values and promotes ethical behavior in the work environment and actively increase others' awareness of the compliance code. So as a supervisor, we need to take this on and making sure that this is part of our supervision experience. It's critical for supervisors to expose supervisees to a variety of ethical dilemmas I had mentioned before, analyze the situations for core ethical issues, so going back to our code of ethics and looking to see where the breakdown is, and identify the ways to respond, and evaluate the benefits and concerns of the potential ways to respond to the ethical dilemmas. So these could be real life dilemmas that are currently happening with the supervisee, or these can be dilemmas that are put together from the supervisor to help them have a better understanding of these scenarios. You would want to problem solve these ethical dilemmas, engage in those ongoing conversations, and then practice any of the decision making that would need to take place. It's important for your supervisees to experience these processes while under supervision, so that way you can provide the feedback throughout and help them for when they don't have a supervision experience happening. And also letting them know that if ethical dilemmas were to continue post-supervision, that there are ways to reach out to colleagues and professionals in the field to have these same conversations to make best practices decisions. Here's an ASR. Ethical and effective supervisory practices impact the following: 1, the consumer; 2, the field; 3, future behavior analysts; 4, supervisees, 5, all of the above. You got it. 5, all of the above. We need to make sure that our ethical practices are in place because it is so important, because it affects so many people and our field. The next ASR, ethical supervisors develop concern for 1, politics, 2, cultural competence, 3, sports, 4, music, 5, none of the above. That's right, number 2, cultural competence. ASR, the ethical behavior analyst as a supervisor, 1, practices within a scope of competence, 2, designs effective supervision and training, 3, follows evidence-based practices, 4, complies with disciplinary requirements for evidence-based supervision, 5, all of the above. That's right, 5, all of the above. We have to remember as behavior analysts, as a supervisor, that we are practicing within the scope of our competence. We're designing effective supervision, following best practices, evidence-based practices, and we're complying within our disciplinary requirements. The next ASR, it is critical for supervisors to 1, be bossy with supervisees, 2, recommend cognitive behavioral therapy for specific cases, 3, incorporate ethics into supervision practices, 4, practice in all areas, even the ones they are not competent in, and 5, number 2 and 4. The answer is number 3, incorporate ethics into their supervision practices. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Miguel, who's going to talk to us about one of the final phases of the supervisory relationship. How do we end this relationship that we have built throughout with our training and our assessment, our data systems, considering ethics, and now where do we go?
Thanks, Jolene. And of course, as she mentioned, we're getting to near the end of this presentation, where we have already seen in a process-like fashion, basically many details that occur within the process of supervision, starting the relationship, assessment of supervisee skills, training determinations, performance monitoring, and of course, issues related to ethics, not only of us as supervisors, but also incorporating the training of ethics in our supervisory practices. So now we're going to be discussing some issues or details related to ending the supervisory relationship. You know, what are some of the steps that we need to take in order to end this process in the way that we should? So first of all, you know, there are several steps that we need to consider based on the existing literature in the topic. Number one, we need to make sure that we conduct an evaluation of the supervisee's skill development. So we need to know how much they have improved, of course. Also, we need to have a clear measure of our effectiveness as supervisors. What was the impact of my practice as a supervisor in the acquisition of skills in my supervisee, which is something that Jolene briefly touched in her presentation. And of course, number 3, making sure that we have the proper documentation completed, ready for submission, for application, et cetera, et cetera. So when evaluating the supervisee skill development, our behavior as supervisors, of course, has to be consistent with the analytic dimension of applied behavior analysis. You know, the supervisee's performance must be evaluated before, during, and after the supervision process. So it's not only something that happens at the end to see what the end result was. We have to make sure that we're able to provide a measure of overall progress to our supervisees, number 1, or that we come up with a measure of overall progress of our supervisees, and also what the impact of supervision was in all parties, parties involved. So we have to directly assess relevant BACB task list items, you know, and this can be done through the use of indirect methods as well as direct methods, direct observation or the assessment of permanent products. And of course, in order to yield to that assessment or to ensure that that assessment is producing the results that we want, we can compare pre-supervision performance with, of course, post-supervision measures. What happens during the final supervision meeting with respect to evaluating the supervisee's skill development? Well, during the supervisee's final supervision meeting, we're going to discuss with the supervisee the results of the supervision evaluation and perhaps share with our supervisees or trainees pre and post results, and these results, of course, need to be included in the supervisee's portfolio. And not only including those results in the supervisee's portfolio, but also evaluating what are some of the components that throughout the supervision process have been included in the supervisee's portfolio. So there has to be a discussion of written recommendations for which skills to focus on improving through subsequent supervision experiences should guide the discussion of the final supervision meeting. So this is a great time where we, our supervisees and us, as supervisors, discuss what are the future goals, whether they're going to be with you as a supervisor or with somebody else, who may actually be taking on the supervisory role. Behavior analytics supervisors should systematically evaluate the outcomes of their own supervision. And this is in relation to my impact as a supervisor in the overall goals established for the supervision process. Did I do my job as a supervisor? Did I successfully and effectively shape up behavior analytics skills and knowledge in my supervisee? And of course, not only behavior analytics skills and behavior analytic knowledge, but also ethical behavior related to ethical behavior in our supervisees. So when evaluating our supervision effectiveness, we must attempt to do this at 3 levels. Jolene already briefly touched on this aspect, but we're gonna try to dive on this in a little more detail. This must be done at 3 levels, as I mentioned. Number 1, we need to see the impact of supervision at the consumer level. So through our supervisees, or the individuals that are working with our that our supervisee is actually providing services to, how significant the changes in consumers have been as a result of good implementation of our supervisees as a result of our supervision. So how significant changes in consumers as a result of supervision? Has supervision actually impacted in a way, in some effective way, the skills or the well-being of the consumers, of our supervisees? At the supervisee level, of course, we have to be very cognizant of the skills that have been acquired, the behavior analytic skills that have been acquired through the process of supervision, but not only the critical skills, but also professional behaviors associated with being a behavior analyst, being a professional behavior analyst. And of course, at the supervisor level, evaluating the effect of aspects of supervision and supervisor decision-making repertoires. Direct and repeated measures of supervisees' behaviors is required to objectively evaluate outcomes of supervision. So again, as mentioned, we have to compare pre and post permanent products, evaluate what our supervisees were able to do before supervision and of course after. It will provide a picture of the supervisee's progress, looking at a pre-post kind of measure. And also, based on those progresses made by our supervisees, it would also provide some measure of my effectiveness or our effectiveness as supervisors. In addition to assessing the level of skill acquisition, we also need to assess how socially valid the supervision process has been for our supervisees, and of course also for additional parties involved. So this can be used to evaluate social significant changes in supervisees' clients as well. Satisfaction with performance of supervisees by consumers and other professionals are going to be indicators of whether our our practices as supervisors have actually been effective and yielded the results that we expected. Supervisee satisfaction is also something that could actually provide evidence of validity measures and effectiveness of our supervision process. So not only how well and how more competent our supervisees feel or with the established set of skills, and the overall supervision process, but also how much change, as mentioned, has been produced in clients and consumers due to our supervisees implementation of target or implementation or delivery of behavioral analytic services. Supervisors should obtain direct feedback from supervisees regarding specific supervision practices. And I think that this is critical, I don't think that this process should be a one-way avenue. It should be an avenue where we as supervisors are also able to change specific aspects of our practice as supervisors based on specific feedback provided by our supervisees. There is no practice that is perfect. And of course, there's always room for improvement. And who better than our supervisees to provide us open, objective feedback of our practices, of our supervision practices. So by obtaining feedback from supervisees, we can get to know what is working right and what was working wrong, in the context of supervision. If there is disagreement, if disagreement actually may lead to changes in aspects or approach to supervision. So what are some of the things that I can improve, as I already mentioned? And of course, reciprocity between supervisee and supervisor that is hypothesized to engender success and mutual satisfaction with the supervision process. If there is disagreement, what are some of the things that I can change? Now, not simply there is disagreement and I change my behavior. There's disagreement and I analyze the variables involved that may actually be impacting the supervisory relationship or the overall effectiveness of supervision. And of course, if there is reciprocity, that may be evidence that there is satisfaction in both parties. This is something that should not really occur only at the end of the supervisory relationship. Supervisors must attempt to evaluate the effect of supervision during and post the supervision process, okay? We must adopt an attitude and engage in behaviors that lead us to always assess our effectiveness of our supervision practices and the overall supervision process. What happens, so now we arrive to a point in the supervision process where the process is actually ending. Maybe my supervisee is now going to perhaps be receiving different supervisory experiences or be exposed to different other supervisory experiences, but I have a relationship with my supervisee, and also I have a professional responsibility with an aspiring behavior analyst or practicing now behavior analyst. So what do I do with this relationship now? Should it just end? What happens? What kind of relationship should I maintain with my supervisee? So in evaluating relationship, the relationship post-formal supervision, it is not that the relationship really needs to end. It is that the relation needs to transition. It is going to be a slightly different format of supervision, where we need to plan for ongoing mentorship and collaboration. So perhaps the focus is not so much on shaping specific professional behaviors and behavior analytic skills, but now we are taking the role of someone who our supervisee can come at any point to discuss different aspects of practice, or if comfortable, of course, discuss, bounce with us ideas regarding different aspects of the implementation or the practice of behavior analysis. So we should plan for ongoing mentorship and collaboration. Establish really how the relationship can be maintained going forward. So what is going to be my role now that I don't have this formal relationship with my supervisee? So the supervisor should actually become a source of support despite changes in the nature of the relationship. So ongoing support and collaboration could occur by, in different ways. I could invite my supervisee to peer groups to establish a professional community for consultation and support. So trying to engage my supervisee now in a community of behavior analysts or aspiring behavior analysts where she can continue getting support. Could continue with meetings for mentoring purposes, and sharing behavior analytic materials and resources as deemed appropriate, of course. Attempting to provide a source for establishing a network with other professionals or past supervisees as well, and again, developing skills that are related to the practice of as a professional behavior analyst, and also professional behaviors. How to interact with other professional behavior analysts, how to share ideas and such. We could provide, of course, letters of recommendation for future career opportunities, or even establish collaboration in clinical or research projects that may be of mutual interest. Lastly, or as a final component, not only evaluating skill development of our supervisees and evaluating the overall supervisory effectiveness of the supervisory relation, we also need to develop a concern for keeping a pretty straight system for documentation. So we have to make sure that all signatures are ready, all forms necessary or relevant forms have been signed, such as the final experience verification form. We need to make sure that both parties retain records or copies of records of monthly experience verification forms, as well as records of supervisory contacts and other notes and narratives that may be relevant to the supervisory process. This is a critical component. We have to make sure that we retain documentation associated with the supervision process so that in the event that there may be some audit or something that, evidence of the supervision process needs to be presented, that information is actually available. As I mentioned, both parties should have access to all records related to the supervision process. ASR. So ending the supervisory relation includes, number one, an evaluation of skills development. Number two, evaluation of supervision effectiveness. Number three, completion of documentation. Number four, all of the above. And number five, none of the above. Please take a second to come up with the answer. And of course, the answer is number four, all of the above. During the final supervision meeting, supervisors should, number one, discuss pre and post supervision evaluation, provide recommendations based on supervision outcomes, have no discussion with supervisee and by phone, and send a thank you letters. Or number five, options 1 and 2 are correct. Please take a second to come up with the answer. And of course, the answer is number 1 and 2. Discuss pre and post measures, or pre and post supervision evaluation measures. And number 2 provides recommendations based on the supervision outcomes. ASR number 3 in this area. Following post-formal supervision, number 1, the relationship should transition and not end. Number 2, provide ongoing mentorship. Number 3, plan for ongoing collaboration. Number 4, provide opportunities for networking opportunities. And number 5, all of these options are correct. Please take a second to consider the answer. And of course, the answer is number 5. All of these are steps that we should consider, or considerations post when we actually arrive to the point of post-formal supervision. So now, and to bring it home, or bring us to the end of this presentation, Jolene will actually provide us some information as to some barriers to some successful supervision.
Okay, so let's jump into the barriers to successful supervision to wrap it up, because it's important for us to highlight some of these areas to make you guys aware that even when setting up the scenarios that we just reviewed, barriers could occur. So even when supervisors take all measures to ensure success in the supervision process, we know that problems may occur. And we want to make sure that we have a way to look at these problems and make a problem-solving solution using a functional behavior approach and defining where the issues are. Supervisors may sometimes react to stressful supervisory situations, have some type of escape responses, ignoring the problem, trying to terminate the relationship, but really at this point we need to identify what the issue is and then talk through it and troubleshoot how we can remedy the situation to have a better supervisory experience. Supervision might be susceptible to subtle negative reinforcement contingencies as well, so we need to keep those in mind. Some specific problems that may relate to the barriers would be the supervisory relationship, or persistent professionalism and interpersonal problems. So would that be looking at like disorganization, poor time management, and issues related to interpersonal skills, difficulty accepting and applying feedback. And like I had mentioned before, feedback is such a critical piece in the supervisory experience, because this is the best way that we can shape and change behaviors as well as teach new behaviors for acquisition. Some of the barriers that we can look at would be negative interactions with the supervisee, loss of interest in the supervision meetings, dissatisfaction with short-term outcomes of the supervision, frequent uncomfortable, unproductive supervision meetings, phone meetings over live meetings, and canceling meetings. Some of these things, if these are ongoing and you don't adjust them quickly, then you're going to have a negative relationship in the supervisee relationship, because these are things that from the very beginning need to be addressed. And we know that this kind of ongoing canceling or the phone meetings could be some form of escape, that we need to kind of take these on and resolve the issue to have better supervision. Supervisors must evaluate the effectiveness of supervision provided. We need to have effective supervisors consistently evaluate the quality and the health of the supervisory relationship. They must attempt to detect any issues prior to worsening. So that's where I mentioned on that list, as soon as you identify one of those issues, you need to have an opportunity as a meeting for assessment to check in to determine how you can change what it is that's the problem. After that evaluation, you need to determine whose behavior must change. Is it the supervisor? Is it the supervisee? Is it both? And then how are you going to make that behavior change? If the supervisor feels that they can mitigate the underlying perceptions and behaviors that are the barriers to the successful supervision, then they must do so. If they feel they cannot mitigate these issues, then at that point it is detrimental to both the supervisor and the supervisee, then at that point it might be necessary to make a referral for a different supervision experience. We know that disorganization and poor time management could be a major issue in supervision because it is an ongoing process. So this could cause issues and failure to complete tasks. Arriving late for a meeting will then hinder the information that you're able to receive during your supervision meetings, as well as receiving the hours that you need. And you need to make sure that if you have materials such as articles and data systems, portfolios and assessments, those need to be available to help with the supervision process. And we need to make sure that organizational issues are at the forefront, because they can end up becoming a very big problem over time. More general problem in all areas of performance is something to be looking at. We want to make sure that we are using some self-monitoring, and if it's an ongoing issue with organization and time management, is there a better way to target these interventions, potentially setting up specific appointments? Problems related to applied practice test would mean that you need to look at the problem with prioritizing aspects of the performance. So if they can't reach the goal of the practice task and meet mastery, how do we then set up some kind of targeted action plan so that they can acquire these new skills and break them down into smaller units so they become fluent in it? Looking at issues related to interpersonal skills, and the supervisees may need to be aware of issues that could arise, such as avoiding the eye contact, avoiding conflict, lack of appropriate assertiveness skills, being unwilling to compromise when appropriate. All of these should be red flags that if these were to come up as persistent issues related to professionalism and interpersonal skills, then they need to be addressed in an effective manner with your supervisee. And the best way to go about that would be using our analysis and taking on a function assessment approach where we define the problem, whether it be disorganization, and then what is the disorganization that's occurring, identify the likely causes and barriers addressed to the problem, and then you would develop your recommendations to address the problem. So just like you would put together potentially a positive behavior support plan for a student or a client, we would look at the same way of if there's an issue related to our supervision, how can we break that down, define the problem, target the skills, and address the problem. If the issue is related to difficulty accepting feedback, which could be an ongoing issue if it's not addressed soon, because maybe the person often finds feedback as a way of arguing or demanding. They feel they have to defend themselves, explain themselves. Maybe other emotional responses occur, crying. So if we are seeing this as a common issue in supervision because of the difficulty of accepting feedback, then a conversation that would be needed would be, what is our best way to provide feedback to one another? And that's something I talked about in the beginning part of the training. When you're setting up those contracts and you're determining how feedback is given, you may need to revisit that if you see that the way that you're delivering it is not effective. If reoccurring issues persist despite any adjustments, then you may need to look at what other variables are at play. You know, socially mediated positive reinforcement, socially mediated negative reinforcement, and are they maintained by multiple variables? So just like we would break down any kind of behavior plan with our learners, like I had mentioned, we would want to see the same issues in our functional assessment related to our supervisor-supervisee relationship to see, is this related to an issue that's related to positive reinforcement, maybe the access to that argument, that exchange that's happening, or is it related to the socially mediated negative reinforcement, that escape or dropping an issue, putting something on hold, not showing up to a meeting, or is it a combination? Explicit discussion regarding these expectations around receiving feedback is also very critical. Like I had mentioned several times, we want to make sure that this process is determined so that you don't have interpersonal problems later in their relationship. And taking a thoughtful approach to issues encountered during supervision. So you want to address issues directly to increase the skills of the supervisee and the future chances of success. Skills of the supervisor may improve through their efforts to examine the literature of supervision and engage in systematic functional assessment and development of an action plan. So going through this process as a supervisor is only going to improve your skill set for future supervision opportunities, and then will also be a nice way to model for the supervisee how supervision practices should look, and how that these are all issues that need to be taken into account. Hopefully, by going through these processes, you're less likely to have the uncomfortable situations, and you'll be more successful in addressing the barriers. So here is an ASR. Barriers to successful supervision include: 1, not taking feedback well; 2, supervisors' behavior maintained by negative reinforcement; 3, all of the above; 4, disorganization and poor time management; 5, supervision being too critical of the supervisee, damaging the supervision relationship. And that would be 3, all of the above. Ways to overcome barriers to effective and successful supervision include: take a functional approach; 2, evaluate the effectiveness of supervision; 3, email complaints to supervisee without the analysis of the targeted issue; 4, create a targeted action plan; or 5, 1, 2, and 4. The answer would be 1, 2, and 4, making sure we take that functional approach, evaluating our effectiveness as a supervisor for supervision, and created a targeted action plan to see where the issue is and how we can make interventions that align. Some overall thoughts is that we need to know that behavior analytics supervision is a process. It's concerned with teaching new and maintaining acquired repertoires for our supervisees. This is our opportunity to give back to the field after we've already gone as supervisors through a supervisee experience, and now we can then shape our aspiring BCBAs in the field to learn the new skills that they need and maintain them throughout their professional development. It's a nice application of principles and technology available for the consumers, and really is a nice overall way to address any of the needs in our field as a supervisor within our supervisory experience and with our supervisee. Supervisors are to review relevant resources and literature, maintain integrative behavior analysis as a science and field of practice, and keep emphasis on supervisory practices with evidence and data-based decision-making. This is the core of our supervision. We need to be staying up to date with our literature. We need to be running things with fidelity. We need to be using our evidence-based practices and ongoing behavior based decision-making, data-based decision-making as a supervisor with our supervisees, and as people provide us feedback as supervisors. Thank you so much for participating throughout this presentation with our ASRs and some of the questions that we had posed. We hope you found this really helpful, and we are excited for the future BCBAs out in the field, and we thank you for all of your hard work as supervisors.